and get going?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will go ahead and get going. We do have a lot of material to cover, so we'll try to be mindful of the time. Just a second, I'm having trouble getting this slide to toggle.
All right.
Okay, I wanted to start by stating the purpose of the meeting. We're in the process of revising fiscal 22 and the next biennium and beyond. By statute, these August estimates that are due by August 15th are planning estimates for the current fiscal year and the next 4 fiscal years pursuant to statute. We will have 2 more opportunities to estimate fiscal 22 through fiscal 24. And those typically happen in October by statute, October 15th. And also we do it in December as well. Want to emphasize, Mr. Chairman, that today is not an official revision to the estimates.
Right.
We're going through and doing planning estimates, but nothing we do today will be an official action. In terms of an assessment of the current situation, the general fund grew by 10.9%, which was the highest growth we've seen in the general fund since fiscal 95, when revenues also grew by 10.9%. Big growth in some of the major taxes. Sales tax was up 12%, individual was up 7.9%, and business taxes were up 38.1%. In terms of what the official estimates are and what happened with revenues, you on December 4th came up with an official estimate of $11,729.0 million for fiscal 21. That's probably the number that you remember. There were due to the session in 2021, there was a fiscal impact of $25 million, which lowered the official estimate to $11,704 million. Actual receipts came in much higher, $12,827.4 million, which led to a difference from official of $1,123.4 million. The estimate that we did for fiscal 22 will probably need revised because the estimate we did in December was $11,996.3 million. We had some legislative impacts as well for fiscal 22 arising from the session. And also in the budget bill, they had booked security sales, which accrued to the abandoned property account. So the official estimate as modified by the General Assembly for fiscal 22 is $11,849.8 million. You can see, if you look at the bottom of the third column of numbers, you can see that $1,123.4 million again that we just talked about on the previous slide. If you look at the top 3 accounts, that accounts for about $1 billion of the $1.1 billion in forecasting difference. Sales was off 328.2, individual was off 330.8, and the business taxes were off $335.3 million. And you can see the growth rates on the right. A few milestones. The sales tax grew by 12%. That's the highest growth rate since fiscal 91 when you did the CARA reforms and we increased the tax rate from 5% to 6%. So very fast sales tax growth. We did a poll of states around the country, and actually 12.0 was rapid growth, but it ended up being the median of the 20 states that we had hard data on. So a lot of states grew fast in the sales tax, and a lot of states are kind of scratching their heads why. On the business taxes, we grew 38.1%. That's the highest business tax growth since we did tax reform in fiscal in 2004, 2005, 2006. So business taxes really took off. Some other states had already started to grow their business taxes before, but this was, Kentucky was a little bit behind, but we more than caught up with the 38.1% growth. And that was a very abrupt change from the recent years of rather tepid growth. And finally, another milestone was the property tax grew by 9.2%. That was the highest rate of growth since fiscal 84. And I had to get the old books out to find a year with faster growth. Noteworthy is the fact that the real property rate will be adjusted downward from the first time since 2008, where it's been at 12.2 cents since 2008. And for tax year 2019, the new rate is 11.9 cents per $100 of assessed value. So real property, I'm sure you're aware that housing prices and valuations have gone up. So we're going to have to make a House Bill 44 adjustment to the property tax rate. Here are some recent growth rates in the general fund, and you can see the 10.9 does stick out during a COVID year nonetheless. Fiscal 20 was the fourth quarter of fiscal 20 was the start of the recession, start and the end of the recession actually, and it grew only 1.5% because we did have a soft fourth quarter, but we did grow in fiscal 20 by 1.5%, and then we had 10.9 on top of that. And I did a monthly chart just so you can see what I found kind of ironic. We met in December, and that negative 39.6 in November, that was the nominal growth in November. That was the last observation when we met in December 4th. And as luck would have it, right after we met, December came in very strong, double-digit growth. We grew 174.4 million. And then you can see the growth continued into January, February, March, and then April and May were up $950 million in nominal receipts. Just exceptional growth in April and May. And the June was down mainly because of the base period from a year before, with the income taxes having postponed deadlines. You can see that quarter by quarter, when we did the estimates, we expected, if you remember, the November receipts were down. We were expecting a flat second quarter and a slightly negative third quarter. We did expect pretty good growth in the fourth quarter, but really we didn't expect 24.8%. The previous year, the fourth quarter went down only 4.5%. We think it was a disastrous quarter, but really when you look at it, some of the taxes even rose, like the individual income tax rose in the fourth quarter of fiscal 20. So the 24.8% was an upward surprise. Turning quickly to the road fund, difference from enacted is $64.6 million. And you can see in that third column of numbers, the differences from the enacted estimates. The main difference was the motor vehicle usage tax. And you can see the nominal receipts in the first column of numbers, $620.9 million in motor vehicle usage. The quarterly growth rate for the road fund was kind of lackluster for the first three quarters, and then it grew 43.8% in the fourth quarter. And that again was some growth in fuels, but a lot of growth in the motor vehicle usage tax. The previous year, the fourth quarter fell 23.6%. So we knew we would have growth in the fourth quarter over that really low hurdle. But even the 43.8 was a little bit higher than our expectation on the road fund growth. Hence the underestimation, excuse me, sorry. A few milestones in the road fund. collections grew by 10.1% for the road fund. That's the highest growth since fiscal 11. And that was back when motor fuels was increasing due to higher average wholesale prices, which increased the motor fuels tax rate. So we had growing fuels back then in fiscal 11. And you have to go back then to find growth higher than the 10.1%. And not surprisingly, the $1,642.3 million was the highest nominal level of collections in road fund history. And the big star was the motor vehicle usage, as I mentioned. It broke the 600 million mark for the first time, and it was the highest nominal collections by over $104.5 million. If you've been watching the news, which I'm sure you have, there were a tremendous amount of both new and used car sales in the previous fiscal year, and it showed up in the usage tax, and we broke 600 million for the first time. Instead of talking about the legislative changes when we go tax by tax, I thought I would cover them at the beginning so that we don't have to be repetitive during the tax by tax discussion.
Okay.
You may recall that there were some 2020 regular session had a few measures, but that session was shortened due to the COVID pandemic, and we addressed those fiscal impacts when we met in December of 2020. So I'm going to concentrate on the 2021 regular session. It had considerably more tax activity. You can see the fiscal impacts. There was even a fiscal impact in fiscal 21 due to one of the bills, which I'll talk about on the very next slide. And you can see the amounts that were deducted in aggregate from our revenue estimates shown in the rows fiscal 22 through fiscal 26. There was a handout, a Word document that we sent you as part of the packet that has an itemized list of each of the bills that were affected. I'm going to go over a few of them very quickly, but if you want to see the itemized list, we scored the bills, and then at the bottom of that spreadsheet, which is on the Word document, we separated it out into the various taxes. Here are the bills that had that moved the needle the most from the 2021 session. I want to talk about three of them just for a short bit. House Bill 278 had that's what created the negative 25 million in fiscal 21, and it creates a negative 125 in fiscal 22 and a negative 100 in fiscal 23. In short, what the deal is on that is that Kentucky disallows deductions against income that's not taxable. That was law before the session, and it's still law after the session. However, there was one source of non-taxable income that they permitted deductions to be taken against, and that was the forgiven PPP loans, which are not taxed at the federal level and also not taxed at the state level. So we had a pretty good idea of the PPP loan activity in Kentucky that was reportable by several sources. We did a couple haircuts to that. We haircutted it in the first place because not all loans were forgiven or will be forgiven. Most of them will, but we did a haircut for the ones that maybe weren't. And then we did a second haircut, Mr. Chairman, because we understood that some business entities would not have enough taxable income to fully utilize the expenses that they took against the PPP loans. So we did two haircuts and came up with the fiscal impacts that I described earlier, which was negative 125 in fiscal 22 and negative 100 in fiscal 23 coming up. The other one that moved the needle was House Bill 563. Those were the so-called school choice tax credits. Those began in fiscal, just a second. Those began in fiscal 22, and they were capped at $25 million a year. And that was just like the PPP loans, it was split between corporate and individual income tax on the scorecard. And we scored that at the full cap of $25 million. And finally, another one that moved the needle was House Bill 249. And in House Bill 249, Section 30 of that bill changed the cap on historical preservation credits, which again can be used against individual or business taxes. That cap got changed from $5 million to $100 million. Big change in that. We did not book the whole $100 million because we knew that the agency could not probably process that much in historical preservations, at least early on. So we didn't score the whole $100 million cap, but we scored a pretty good size of it. And the other part was the film incentives, which were changed in section 16 through 20 of House Bill 249. That one is a little bit more subtle. The cap got reduced from 100 million, which it was before, to 75 million, which seems okay, but they changed it from non-refundable to a refundable credit. And that created a fairly large fiscal impact. When it was non-refundable, a lot of times these film companies that come into Kentucky to do some short-term activity, they don't accrue an income tax liability to be able to use those tax credits. So in a lot of cases, they couldn't use the credit that they were awarded. But now that they're refundable, you can file an informational return without a tax liability and get your film credits refunded to you. So that created a negative fiscal impact. So those were the big ones that when we go through, especially the income taxes, that those are the reasons we're taking deductions from those taxes. Finally, I'm going to end this introductory part with some of the forecasting challenges that are in front of us. I say dependent variables with problematic history. It's not really problematic history. History's history. It's just the history's got a lot of noise in it right now. There were a lot of COVID-related changes to consumption patterns. The example I think of is the motor vehicle usage, which in the fourth quarter of fiscal 20 had next to nothing in terms of, because the Stay Healthy at Home initiative prohibited folks from going to car lots and purchasing vehicles. So we had very low receipts. And then the next year we broke 600 million. So we had a lot of, it added some noise to the motor vehicle usage tax series, which makes forecasting a greater challenge. We also have changing tax policy that is, corrupt's probably not the right word, but it adds noise to most of the dependent variables. Here I'm thinking mainly of the income taxes. I'll talk about corporate. In corporate, we changed tax laws in the 18 and 19 session very dramatically. We lowered the rate from 6 to 5. We changed from Nexus consolidated filing to unitary filing and did market-based sourcing, did a lot of changes to the corporate tax. And that kind of stuff makes it difficult to have a policy neutral dependent variable. And then, of course, the exogenous wealth effects from the fiscal stimulus. I noticed that quite a bit when I did the sales tax forecast. You can see quarters very clearly that had fiscal stimulus. It also shows up in the lottery receipts, which I'll talk about at the end. But those exogenous wealth effects add noise to the dependent variables. And as a practical matter, it's very difficult to tease out the cyclical growth from the fiscal stimulus effects. Each analyst was tried to do that, and it was very difficult to create policy neutral dependent variables. I would also note that in a lot of cases, the time series model is sensitive to the latest observations. So that was a challenge for specification. And finally, in terms of forecasting challenge, we may not have seen the end of COVID-related uncertainty. I know that the July IHS market forecast that we used had a pretty optimistic forecast for the path of COVID, and things have changed a little bit since that forecast. And if you've been watching the news, it's story number one on every channel. So I don't believe that we're done with COVID-related uncertainty. So that's something to consider going forward. But those are just the introductory remarks that I had. If you have any questions, if you don't, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Jones, Dr. Michael Jones, to talk about the national and state economies. But hearing and seeing no questions, I'm going to go ahead and flip presentations over to Michael. And I'll let Michael do the switching.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to say it's nice to see you, but of course, we're doing it virtually, but I am happy to be here, and I'm happy all of you could join us. As you might imagine, in the IHS market forecast, we are using the forecast that was published in July. There are numerous things that they address, which we know may be changing going forward. So I'm going to lay out what the assumptions are that underlie the current forecast, but I think we're all aware that there could be some potential changes as we get closer and closer to our final date in December of making our final forecast. In the control scenario, GDP growth is expected to rise to 6.7% in 22 and 3% in fiscal 23. The assumptions are that this most recent quarter, which is not quite history, even though it's passed in the calendar, the numbers have not been released from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and made final, we are assumed to have hit our pre-pandemic peak in the most recent calendar quarter, which was the last quarter of fiscal 21. The control scenario assumes that the vaccination rate outpaces the spread of new strains. So the idea is, in the control scenario, we will begin to get ahead of COVID and have vaccination rates grow faster than new strains or the spread of COVID overall. The control scenario assumes that the previous stimulus efforts and the March American Recovery Plan, the $1.9 trillion package that was passed in March, they are in the baseline. However, there is no assumption that the proposed infrastructure bill contained within the American Jobs Plan or the American Family Plan is included. So everything that has been passed from March and previous is in the control in the base forecast, but is not assumed to include any of the new proposals. Consumer spending is expected to pick up. And it's expected to shift more towards services. We know the stories, lots of people stayed home, decided there were home improvement projects that needed to be done, and many items were purchased or ordered and delivered. But we expect to see a greater transition to services. So a 6.4% increase in 22 and a 4.1% in 23, but again, shifting towards services. Federal Reserve is expected to maintain the federal funds rate near 0%. They're expected to actually start to raise interest rates at the beginning of fiscal 24 in the control forecast, first quarter of fiscal 24. And oil prices are expected to be at $72 a barrel in the first quarter of 22. And considering they're at $71 today, that's a pretty accurate forecast, and expected to ease to $65 by the time we reach the second quarter of fiscal 23. Before I move on to the other assumptions, and I'm sorry, I should have said, you saw at the top of the slide, there's a 50% weight on that control forecast. I wanted to address the fact that there are several items in the IHS market forecast that could be termed transitory. things that are expected to be large impacts, but expected to dissipate over time. The first is inventory building. We know that many businesses had a disruption in their supply chain. We've all heard the stories of delays in chips and other critical items that are needed for the production of many, many products. And so we have this record low situation of the ratio of inventories to sales. Sales have been tremendous while inventory replenishment has been rather slow. And the idea is in the IHS market forecast that we are going to start seeing strong impacts to GDP from this increase in inventories that are expected to be replenished, if you will, over the first 2 quarters of fiscal 22. We, of course, can't turn on the news or the radio without hearing people talk about inflation. Now, we know that we mean something different when we say inflation. We mean a broad level across the entire marketplace in prices. But we hear a lot of stories about individual products. The classic example, of course, has been the lumber index. Well, the lumber index has gone up and now is below the pre-pandemic numbers. It's actually interesting to see how these changes have occurred over time as different examples of Say's law has come into play, as many increases in the quantity supplied have been brought about due to these high prices. But overall, IHS market is assuming that most of the inflation pressures are expected to slow as we go forward. Some are expected to reverse. But more importantly, I think we need to make sure we understand that what we're saying is that in many cases, the supply, as it comes into the marketplace, the prices associated with that quantity supplied are expected to slow. Not all will reverse, of course, but the growth rate in prices is expected to slow as supply chains come back into place and labor force participation increases. Motor vehicles, I think it's fair enough to say that some of the outrageous stories we've seen, people with a 3-year-old Tesla being able to sell it for more than what they paid 3 years ago. The used prices for vehicles, the prices for used vehicles, I believe IHS market blatantly called it unsustainable. And I think they are correct. However, in terms of new vehicles and vehicle parts, we're expecting the supply chain issues to resolve, which of course is wonderful for Kentucky because we do have such a large impact in a relationship to the automobile market. And finally, federal fiscal policy. As I'm sure you're aware, the enhanced unemployment benefits for all states are scheduled to end this coming September 20 of 21, calendar 21. And half of the states have already withdrawn from the emergency unemployment programs. To put that in perspective for Kentucky, we have approximately 60,000 people who are receiving unemployment insurance in Kentucky at this time. 20,000 of those are on what you would consider standard state unemployment insurance. So approximately 60,000 of those recipients are on these enhanced programs, these extended programs, or are receiving enhanced benefits. So everyone right now is getting the extra $300 in Kentucky. But if there is no extension, and the assumptions in the control forecast are there are no extensions, in September, not only will the extra $300 for all individuals go away, approximately 40,000 individuals who are on these extended programs will no longer be receiving unemployment insurance. And finally, the American Recovery Plan expanded the child tax credit, and the IRS is currently sending those checks as an immediate cash transfer to individuals. They're front loading that tax credit, and they will be receiving monthly checks. They started in July, and they will run through December. The estimates are approximately 1.1 million families in Kentucky are receiving these checks. The remainder of the tax credit will be included in their tax return when they file their tax return for this calendar year, this coming April. But so these are direct stimulus payments that are still occurring, but in the case of the unemployment benefits, we're expecting the vast majority of it to stop this coming September in just a few months. And for the tax credit, the direct payment will end at the end of December, and the remainder of the money will be included in the individual's tax returns. So again, these are some transitory issues that the IHS market forecast assumes that they will be abating as we move forward in time. Now, to the actual remaining scenarios, the optimistic scenario is weighted at 30%. I think it's fair to say that IHS market in this forecast does believe that there is a lot of upside risk to the current forecast. They think there's a good chance that we're going to have a more positive scenario. In this scenario, GDP would grow by 8.3 and 3.4% in fiscal 22 and 23. Now that compares to the 6.7 and the 3% in the control forecast. Now this is mainly due to two reasons. One, the idea is that consumers have this most recent cash infusion of the stimulus, 1.9 trillion that was passed in March. And the assumption is they go out and they spend it aggressively. In other words, less is held back for an emergency for most individuals. The second major assumption is that widespread vaccination, adherence to safety guidelines, we actually start to see a decline in new COVID cases and certainly a decline in deaths. So a lot of the impetus for the control forecast had been that growth rate that we saw in widespread vaccination rates, and it assumes that that continues and that we start to see a reverse in COVID cases. Employment increases by 5.1% in fiscal 22 as compared to the 4.5% in the control forecast. The unemployment rate gets down to 4% by the fourth quarter of fiscal 22 as versus 4.6% in the control forecast. Real consumer spending increases by a very strong 8.2% in fiscal 22. Now that compares to the 6.4% in the control forecast. And it also is associated with the assumption that in the optimistic forecast, the Fed will begin to put on the brakes sooner than the control forecast. In fact, almost 1 year soon. They assume the Fed acts by the first quarter of fiscal 23 versus the first quarter of fiscal 24 in the control forecast. The unit sales of light vehicles grows at a robust 6.5%, and that is very robust compared to the 1.9% in the control forecast. And finally, they assume the global economy does very well, recovers from COVID more quickly than in the baseline forecast. Now, again, the downside risk, the pessimistic forecast only has a 20% probability. And the key here, of course, is once again of those COVID assumptions. Now, the GDP growth looks a little strange, 5.5% in fiscal 22 and 3.3% in 23. That compares to 6.7% in the control and 3% in 23 in the control. So here, IHS Markit is assuming that we have a delayed shift. It's not as strong in 22, but more of that consumption, more of that economic activity occurs in 23. So lower in 22, higher in 23 in the versus the control forecast. And again, why? Pace of vaccination slows, we do not reach herd immunity. And more contagious COVID strains become the dominant source of COVID cases, which results in more cancellations, more pulling back by consumers, more things that impact and slow the growth in both consumption and spending consumption, I should say. The consumer spending at 5% and 4.6% as compared to 6.4 and 4.1 in the control forecast, again, shifting it out a little in 23. Employment increases by 4.1% versus 4.5% in the control. And the unemployment rate is down to 4.8. Now that's versus 4.6 in the control forecast, so higher unemployment. And real consumer spending grows by 5% versus the 6.4% in the control forecast. And here, the global economy is assumed to have kind of that 2 steps forward, 1 step back pattern, where we see setbacks and recovering from COVID. Obviously, we've heard numerous stories of countries in Europe, the Middle East, getting ahead and then falling back. Unfortunately, we seem to be following that same pattern here if the trends continue the way the news headlines have been reading. So that's the overall layout of the control optimistic and pessimistic scenario. Again, a 50, 30, 20% weighting across those scenarios. A lot of assumptions based on transitory activity and a lot of assumptions based on what happens with COVID, as one would expect. I'm going to go through the variables. There's a couple of new ones in here. I don't want to take too long. I know we have a long meeting to cover, so I'll go over the basics and you will see a sort of a pattern repeat itself. One thing I will point out is this is the planning estimate meeting. We are going to be showing you the assumptions out to fiscal 26. However, I still believe the most important thing for our group is to focus on the next 2 fiscal years. And you might imagine when it comes to the IHS Markit forecast in the long run, most of the forecasts are asymptotically approaching a trend line. So I'm not going to spend too much time, unless it's a true anomaly, discussing anything out in the fiscal 25 or 26 range. So starting with the GDP, here's our classic control optimistic pessimistic graph. And you can clearly see after the initial drop off, the impact from COVID, we can see that greater growth rate in both the optimistic and the control scenario with a much more muted growth rate in the pessimistic. Exactly what we discussed, or I'm sorry, what I described earlier in the differences between the forecasts. Here it is in terms of fiscal year growth rates. Again, I will point out, I'll just mention this one more time. Fiscal 21, while we think of it as history because of the calendar, the actual numbers have not been finalized. And there is a difference in what the last quarter of the fiscal year is expected under the different scenarios. So that's why it does not appear that fiscal 21 would be treated as history, because they are differences in the different forecasts. So again, here we see the strong growth in GDP in the control forecast, comparing that to the 8.3 in the optimistic and the 5.5 in the pessimistic. And again, as we go out, we can see it gradually going back to the long-term growth rates. We do see some slight anomalies, again, in the in the pessimistic forecast, relatively strong GDP growth compared to the control. But again, that's because of that low assumption in fiscal 22 in the pessimistic, that 5.5 versus the 6.7. So a little bit of a shift out. This is a comparison as to what we were expecting the last time we were together. In December of 20, you could see that we had 0.6% and 2.2% forecasted respectively for fiscal 21 and 22. And we can clearly see that the current forecast, it's August because it's August when we're meeting. But again, this is based upon the July IHS market forecast. You can see the strong growth rates assumed in 21 and 22. Employment, similar situation, a significant drop off and a snap back to what we would expect to be closer to the long run growth average in both the optimistic and the control, and a more muted growth in the pessimistic. Again, much like GDP, we see the growth rates, strong growth assumed for 22, and we can see that declining growth rate. To borrow a phrase from my good friend Greg Harkenreiter, we have high hurdles that we're going to have to go over given some of the returns that we've seen after the drop-offs in 20 and 21. Here's employment and manufacturing. You can see that it already started to be a decline, a downturn trend that you observed in fiscal 19 going towards 20. Obviously, COVID significantly exacerbated that. Now we see the return back. Strong returns to manufacturing in many cases, but still not getting us back to that pre-pandemic peak, and then a continuing decline over time. Here's the growth rates, relatively muted, 2.3 versus 2.6%, depending on the range. Again, this is an unusual one because in the pessimistic scenario, they assume we don't get back to spending on services. We continue spending on items. And so we actually get a stronger growth rate in manufacturing in the early year, fiscal 22 of the forecast, but then we go back to declines as we continue out over the time period of the horizon of the forecast. I apologize for this. I accidentally forgot to include the line graph for the housing starts. And this is housing starts. The line graph essentially showed exactly what we have here. And I apologize for it not being in there. We can email it to everyone if need be. You can see we had an incredibly strong amount of housing starts in fiscal 20 and 21. A lot of responses to demand for individual houses, people wanting to move out of more congested multifamily situations in urban areas, responding to COVID. But while this may look shocking, if you go back to pre-pandemic, the long run trend for housing starts in the United States is a decline over time. And there's numerous reasons for that. Household formation rates, people's desire to not have as much maintenance and other items as the population ages. But in general, you can see that going forward, again, that high hurdle to get over. After you've had a 17% growth rate in housing starts, it's going to be very difficult to have any kind of sustained growth. And you can certainly see that in all forecasts, we have quite a bit of decline. Now, in the early year, fiscal 22, it's mostly based on whether or not we have a situation where interest rates go up due to Fed actions, whether or not we can get through the supply gridlock, keep those housing prices down. But of course, it's not just lumber. There's lots of other items that were disrupted that go into making a house in terms of overall supply, whether it's pipes, fittings, all the other things that one would need. So, and again, I apologize for that. And again, you can see how this compares to what was included in the underlying forecast last time. Significant increase at 17.3 versus 6.7. And then again, a decline going out in 22, just not as much of a decline. Let's see if I can't move this because I'm having a hard time seeing which slide we're on. I apologize. I haven't memorized the slides that well. Does anyone know how to make this go away? I do apologize, but I literally don't know what slide I'm on because I can't see the top.
It's real personal income.
Oh, thank you. I wish I could figure out how to make this go though, because it's really unfortunate that I can't see the slides, but okay. So I apologize. I don't. All right, so, okay, real personal income. I apologize for that. Sorry for the disruption. As you can see, the real personal income, you cannot miss those two large spikes. They're clearly related to the government stimulus payments that were paid out to families and individuals, of course. And you can see that in the control and in the pessimistic scenario, the growth rates are essentially the same, but there is a higher growth rate assumed in the optimistic scenario. Here's our growth rates. Again, we had high hurdles to get over, have a hard time achieving more than that in fiscal 22. And then our growth rates go back to what our long-term averages have been over the years. Compared to where we were last time, again, 21 and 22, we were expecting a slight decline of 0.2% in 21, instead 5.4% now. And then in the out year, fiscal 22, we were expecting again a decline of 0.8. Now the current assumption would be a 1.8% decline overall. So now we normally do not do wages and salaries in the national numbers. However, because one, it's an important variable. It's used in both, I believe, the individual income tax, but a few other forecast taxes. I wanted to include it here. Again, we do realize, of course, a lot of the variables that we present here are in real terms. We're trying to show the underlying impact, but we tax on nominal basis. So again, thought we'd add in the wage and salary assumptions at the national level to show the assumptions here. And again, you can see that drop off that occurred due to COVID returning. And again, in the pessimistic scenario, a longer tail to try to get back to the growth rate we've achieved versus optimistic and control being more along the lines of the recent long-term growth rates. Here it is comparing the two. Again, strong growth in the optimistic 9.3% versus the 8.4%. And then slowly returning to, again, something approaching the long-term growth rates. We did not present this last time, but I did want to show you if we had put this variable in December of 20, we would have assumed 21 would have been a 3.1% versus the current 5.1% growth rate. And for fiscal 22, 4.7 was the underlying assumption in the IHS market forecast versus the current 8.4% in the current forecast. Real consumer expenditures, excluding food and energy. Again, you can see the tremendous drop off. A lot of the assumptions that go into this variable are directly related to what the IHS market forecast assumes about the Fed actions and inflation growth. Again, we can see strong growth in the near term, tapering out towards long run averages as we move out in the out years, compared to what was said in December, 2.5% in the current forecast for fiscal 21 versus 1% and 6.4% versus 2.6%. So again, robust, but again, a shift in the current forecast, especially in control, more towards services rather than focusing so much on goods. We normally do not show this variable, but I thought given all the talk, it would be a good idea to include the chain price index for consumer spending. This is Global Insight, IHS Market's version of how they account for CPE growth, the preferred method of inflation. They do all urban consumers CPI index, but I thought I would focus more on what IHS Market focuses on. And you can again see in that long-term trend, there's not much of a difference between optimistic and control, but in the pessimistic, we do have, again, a much slower increase in prices. And again, they're assuming that is because in the in the pessimistic scenario, things once again start to slow down due to COVID. You can see the growth rates assumed in prices. Again, this is more of a core number excluding energy and food. And you can see the current assumption would be a 3% or 3.2% increase in the control versus the optimistic. And then again, returning more to that long-term 2%. Recall that a 2% increase in PCE is the Fed's goal. So we would see possible Fed action in the optimistic scenario here, but in the pessimistic scenario, it's very slow growth overall. Real consumption of durable goods, again, you just cannot miss what occurred. A slight decrease and then a tremendous increase during COVID. I mean, if my neighborhood is anything to be used as a anecdotal evidence, a lot of people decided to do some major home renovations. I saw a lot of deliveries from Lowe's, a lot of construction dumpsters in front of houses. So there's no doubt people were certainly consuming refrigerators, washers and dryers, numerous things in the durable goods category. And you can see in the forecast, 20.9% growth for fiscal 21, not entirely completed yet because of the VEA numbers. And again, that high hurdles, if you will, fiscal 22 through 26, very, very slight growth over top of what we've already observed. Not surprising considering the tremendous amount of consumption increase that we have seen in durable goods. Consumption of gasoline and oil, again, tremendous drop off during COVID, travel restrictions, and now again, not anything that you would not expect. Optimistic, higher than control, pessimistic, lower, things getting back to a long run trend in each case. But again, what would you expect? In 22, we're talking 18 and 22% respectively in the control and optimistic, and then essentially very, very slight declines to slight increases in the out years as we snap back from the major impacts of COVID. An important variable, obviously, for Kentucky, unit sales of light vehicles. The COVID drop off when dealerships were closed, we saw that just essentially zero activity. But now that it's coming back, we're hearing so much about that delay due to the chip shortage. My understanding is the people who follow this industry closely have literally started flying drones over the parking areas around production facilities to see how many vehicles have been completed all but for the chips and are just parked outside waiting for the parts necessary to have actual completion of the vehicle as the chips are shipped in. And again, I think this might be one of the strongest differences in the control, optimistic, pessimistic forecast of any variable in the forecast. The optimistic forecast, continued growth, peaks, approximately fiscal 24 and starts to decline. Compare that, of course, to the pessimistic where things drop back off again and then slowly start to rise back up. So a larger spread than in most forecasts, the difference between control, optimistic, pessimistic. Again, you can see the numbers, strong 8.5% growth in the control, and the optimistic continues the growth for at least through fiscal 22, but again, in the pessimistic, we go right back to the negative. Shut down, consumers pull back, more and more problems in the supply line, for example. So we can clearly see that it makes a real difference on this one, whether it's control, optimistic, or pessimistic. Here's the control forecast as previously presented. So again, strong growth, 8.5% and 1.9% respectively. Compare that to what the underlying numbers were in the December forecast, 4.3 and 0.9. Real gross private fixed investment. I think for our purposes, really, I won't belabor this point, but business structure spending, including drilling and mining facilities, is really more of the story underlying here. Strong growth in the optimistic forecast, essentially back to trend and control, and again, a slow decline, and then back to long-term trends in the pessimistic forecast. Again, here in the optimistic, fiscal 22, 9.2% versus 6.2%, but then everything returns essentially to long-run trend in the out years. Here's the comparison again, 0.9% in fiscal 21 versus 5% for 21 in the current forecast, and 0.8 versus 6.2. Again, tremendous growth assumed compared to what was presented in December. Real exports of goods and services, exactly what you would expect. Essentially a slight difference depending on the control, optimistic, pessimistic forecast. But in terms of general numbers, we've had fairly strong growth assumed for 22, and then again, things tapering out in the out years. Real exports of motor vehicles and parts, obviously very important for Kentucky. Again, you can see that increase up, slight slowdown, and then essentially optimistic is ahead of control and pessimistic, but they're almost the same. And you can see why, this strong growth, 9.9% across the board for 21, growing into high double digits. high teens, I should say, for fiscal 22, and then a slight decline to negative growth in 24 through 26. I did go through that rather quickly. As different things are presented, if you have questions about the underlying IHS market assumptions, I'll be happy to answer them. If there's any overall questions, I'm happy to pause and answer those now.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a lot of the big assumption about switching over from durable goods to services or purchases of goods versus services.
Correct.
Do you think, and I think there was a positive projection from that as services pick up. It seems to me like durable goods are purchased in big chunks, you know, like you buy a lawnmower versus a service, which you might pay per month.
True.
Is that a good assumption that those sales taxes would be accounted for?
I would say that is a good assumption. We know people have had issues getting the durable goods that they desire. Again, I hate to use casual anecdotes, but I heard numerous people in my neighborhood saying, well, I had to mix and match which brands I used for appliances because the refrigerator I wanted was available, but the matching stove was not. So I went with a different brand. But it didn't stop them from making their purchase. It just mixed and matched different brands. I think services, we're going to start see, more and more people, whether it's the casual services, kind of like you were indicating, did you buy a lawnmower or are you using a lawn service? But I think we're also going to see a tremendous amount, especially in the optimistic scenario, things like travel services, the types of services that have really been put off and delayed. Now we have greatly expanded, and I'm sure Greg could speak to this better than I, but we've greatly expanded the number of services that are covered by sales taxes in Kentucky. So I think in either way, we will be receiving, our sales taxes on them. But I think for a lot of people, they've done what they needed to do on those purchase of durable goods. And now they are looking to move forward on those services. They want to go to the concerts. They want to do the outdoor activities. They want to go and experience travel, stay at hotels. And so I think, those services are expected to grow tremendously if we can get COVID under check.
Okay,
So
and
I think
compensate for the big drop in now that everybody has a new washer and dryer. And
correct.
okay.
So, are there any other questions concerning the national assumptions in the IHS market forecast? I realize it looks strange, but I'm looking up at the large screen where you are versus trying to look ahead for the presentation. Okay, hearing none, I will discuss the Kentucky economic slides. So our first slide, again, coming out of the MAC model, is Kentucky employment. And again, tremendous drop off. We've talked about the number of people who have been unemployed. The unemployment insurance program has paid out over the course of this $6.4 billion. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to transfer payments, but that tremendous drop in employment it's hard to really fathom how much of an impact that is. You can see the decline back in fiscal 08 and 09 when we experienced a Great Recession. This was a tremendously different animal. When you're trying to keep people safe and home and not intermixing and say, here's extended benefits, we're trying to keep you safe, please don't go into work unless you absolutely have to. That is the result. It was a tremendous drop off. And now we're coming back. And you can see that in the control forecast, we're getting back to what you would consider kind of the long run growth rate. That pessimistic forecast, though, it still takes quite a while to recover. And here's the comparison of the two. 4.1% in the control forecast for fiscal 22 versus 4.8% for the optimistic and only 3.7 in the pessimistic scenario. Again, everything on there out is just more of a return to long-term trend. Compared to the United States, you can see that in fiscal 22, we are expecting the US to experience faster growth in Kentucky. And that does continue out for the remainder of the forecast. We are in step with what is occurring in the national, but we do not exceed the national numbers in any of the current forecasted fiscal years. Here's our manufacturing employment, I believe. Yes, manufacturing employment, again, same story as a smaller base, of course, and the 200,000 individual, but still the same story. And again, strong differences between control and optimistic, 3.9 versus 4.7%. And again, going on out, we see declines for the most part in control and pessimistic for FY24 out through 26. Again, in this situation, we are ahead of the United States, US as a whole, I should say, 3.9% in fiscal 22 for Kentucky versus 2.3% for the US. That trend continues for the next fiscal year. In fact, we do slightly better, even if they are declines in all years of the forecast. But again, once you get out to 24 and beyond, it's a shrinking overall size of the market. I'm sorry, the labor market in manufacturing. Personal income, again, you cannot overstate the impact of the transfer payments that have been here. But again, we'll do transfer at the very end. But you see those large spikes that occurred due to the stimulus payments. And then again, the control and the optimistic slightly ahead of trend growth rate. And you can see in the pessimistic, we're slightly below long-term trend. Comparing the two, I apologize for the intersection of the line through the labels, but coming off of that 7.6% growth rate in fiscal 21, we essentially dropped to flat in fiscal 22. And then we start to regain growth. Again, a tremendous increase in income for both 20 and 21. And in the control forecast, essentially flat growth, slightly positive at 0.9%, and the optimistic slight decline and the pessimistic, and then getting back to what I would consider to be slightly above long-term trend in terms of income growth in the Commonwealth. Compared to the nation as a whole, stronger growth in 21, again, less, and since we're essentially flat in fiscal 22, and then less than the assumed growth rate in the US as a whole every year of the forecast. This is the comparison, I'm sorry, between what was presented in December versus current. You can clearly see that last December, we were expecting a growth rate of 0.9% in fiscal 21 versus 7.6%. And again, we were expecting slow, continuous growth in December of 1.2%. But this year, coming off of that incredibly high growth rate, flat for fiscal 22. Again, we discussed earlier that we had the national slide for wage and salaries. We always talk about wage and salaries in the Kentucky MAC model. And again, you can see that strong growth coming off of the decline in COVID. You can see in both in the optimistic and the control, we get back to above long-term trend growth, whereas pessimistic kind of brings us back into where we have been in terms of the long-term percentage growth rate. Again, strong growth, fiscal 22, 7.8, 8.8% respectively. And then again, mediating as we go out in the outer years of the forecast. Slightly less growth every year than the US as a whole. Again, for fiscal 22, 8.4% for the US as a whole, 7.8% for Kentucky. And then again, every year of the forecast, just slightly below the growth rates assumed for the US as a whole. Compared to last time, again, strong growth compared to the previous presentation, 5.5 and 7.8% versus 1.4 and 4.5% respectively. Now, again, I think we had not done transfer payments, maybe the last meeting or two where we were all together. Transfer payments had become a less interesting story. And needless to say, that story has changed. You can see that small increase. If you go way back in history to fiscal 08, that was a great recession. That was the first time Kentucky, we depleted our unemployment insurance trust fund. We have a tremendous amount of activity and transfer payments as incomes went down. A lot of people's SSI and other transfer payments went up. And again, that is nothing compared to what we clearly see for the two waves. Unemployment insurance has been in there consistently, but of course we see that transfer payment of the stimulus checks that were received by the vast majority of Kentucky residents. And so you can see the tremendous growth rate. And now we're expected to actually have a slight decline and then return back to that long-term trend. I think it's easiest to see it in the numbers. For fiscal 20 and 21, 21 and 17% growth across the board. That essentially is history. We'll get a finalized number for fiscal 21, but I don't think it's going to move the needle much. And so now we're going to see this drop off. And again, that's just compared to what we occurred previously. It's not surprising that after such a tremendous amount of transfer payments, once the unemployment insurance, no additional stimulus is assumed, you would expect to see a tremendous drop off compared to transfer payments previously. And then we get back to what we would consider kind of a continued growth rate. Actually does have quite a bit of growth in the outer years, 5.5 and 5.6% respectively in 25 and 26. But again, focusing on the main task we will have at hand, we can see in the near term quite a decline compared to the previous year. fiscal year, and then a normal 1.7 to 2% growth rate for 23. Again, compared to what we assumed, we had assumed some 2.4 and a decline of 4.2, and now we see a 17% and a 15% turnaround. So again, quite a difference compared to what we expected when we met in December. I know I went through that very quickly, but I did not want to belabor that. But if there's any questions on the Kentucky variables, I'll be happy to go back. If any questions arise on the underlying forecast as we go through the individual taxes, just feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to answer anything. I have the full book here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions I can. So at that point, I will pause and wait and see if anyone has any questions.
The one comment that's worth making is that the decline in transfer payments is sufficient to offset the gains in wages and salaries to give you this zero change in personal income. That's quite a striking result, it seems to me.
I would agree.
And Michael, you kind of already said this, but as we go through the different numbers, if we can be, because just reminded of how many of the models in the future that we're going to go through each of the taxes, the models that we're looking at, how many use kind of dollar amounts and how many, if any, of the assumptions use percentage changes. I mean, obviously we're in a big kind of inflection point. And so if any of the models are using percentage changes, if the presenters can just make sure and bring that to our attention, I'm sure it'd be helpful, because if we're using percentages and not dollar amounts, that's going to make a big difference in these inflection periods, just because of the comparison.
Absolutely. Everyone who's going to be presenting, of course, can hear that and is either in the room or going to be presenting in a moment. And I'm sure they will all make sure to specify if there's any place where real versus nominal, and anywhere where percentage changes versus nominal or real numbers are used in the forecast. If there's no other questions, I will turn it over to, let me switch PowerPoints. I apologize. Revenue slides?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, can you move it to the beginning?
Yes. Individual income taxes first.
Yeah.
Thomas, do you need someone to move your slides forward?
Yes, please.
Would you like me to do that for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's move on to the first slide. Let's take a look at the individual income tax. The individual income tax is the largest tax in the state. It makes up approximately 40% of the general fund. Here you can see some of the individual income tax receipts history. If you take a look there at the FY19 decline, that was due to the tax reform legislation that lowered all individual income tax receipts. It primarily showed up in withholding. In FY20, receipts seemed to pick up right where it left off and improved significantly thereafter. Growth in FY21 occurred across withholding, declarations, and net receipts. It was only fiduciary that saw a small decline. And you can see there, I've separated out the 4 quarters of FY21 for you. And you can see the large jump in growth in the fourth quarter. The fourth quarter has always contained the plurality of individual income tax receipts. Historically, it contains 29% of the year's receipts. In FY21, it was slightly higher. It was 31.6% of total receipts. We just received a couple of days ago the July receipts for 21. Individual income tax receipts grew 1.5% compared to July 2020. The withholding component grew by 4.1%. So withholding did well. It was the other components that offset it. Declarations was the primary offsetter. Its declarations fell by $8 million. Now, normally July is not a large declarations month. It's usually in the single digits millions or the low double digit millions. It's a very small declarations month. But in this particular case, compared to the previous July, it was lower by $8 million. And that was really the big difference for July. Next slide, please. Here you can see my methodology. My methodology for withholding hasn't changed. It's the exact same model specification that I've used many times in the past. The declarations model is similar to what I've used in the past, a 3-year moving average, but seeing as how the model can't see what happened in the past was an anomaly, a one-time event with the lower declarations, we've added a nominal $20 million to FY22 only, and then proceeded with the 3-year moving average. Next slide, please. Similarly, with the net returns model, the 3-year moving average model, a very naive approach. However, we will not be seeing the $93 million in UI income that was taxable. We will not be seeing that going forward, so that was adjusted. The fiduciary model, we expect very low balances going forward, very small single digit, but positive. Next slide, please. Michael showed you Kentucky wages and salary. I show it again here. There's a couple of things to really get into the weeds on. First is that the Kentucky wages and salary forecast is stronger than, the growth rates are stronger than pre-recession growth rates in all the scenarios, while the pessimistic scenario is roughly the same as the growth rates seen pre-recession. Also, the control and pessimistic scenarios lie nearly on top of each other. And going out to the end of our forecast horizon, they're almost exactly the same. Next slide, please. So here's the withholding forecast. A couple of things of interest here as well. The control and optimistic are nearly on top of each other. You can barely see the differences. The difference between these 3 scenarios, even out to FY26, is very small. The forecast for withholding is to improve in a very monotonic fashion for all 5 years of the forecast. Next slide, please. And here you see all 3 scenarios for withholding. Most of the tax reform legislation showed up in the withholding forecast for FY19. You can see that there. It reduced the withholding tables for all individuals. All 3 scenarios have some similar traits. There's high growth in FY22 growth, continuation of 21. There's tapering growth in the out years, and there's very similar growth paths. The difference between the optimistic FY26 and the pessimistic FY26, that would be your upper and lower bounds, is $154 million or 2.9% difference. The difference between the optimistic and the control in FY26 is just $40 million or 0.7%. So they're very similar even in FY26. Next slide, please. Declarations is notoriously very difficult to forecast. I've tried dozens of models and nothing ever seems to work out well. I think maybe 2 or 3 times in 18 years have I ever gotten a model to fit. And usually we end up going back to this very naive approach of a 3-year moving average. The problem really lies in the fact that the declarers are making decisions based on information from in their history, what the previous declarations payments were, and they're also looking forward about what they think is going to happen in the future with the economy and their sales. There's no pattern to declarations. I've examined this from every direction. It's neither cyclical nor counter-cyclical. It's clearly an acyclical series. There's also no pattern in the history about what happens after a peak. There's no pattern after what happens after a new trough. The only kind of pattern that I could really see was that after a double-digit increase, it is usually followed by a significant decline in the following year. That did not happen only 2 times in the entire history of the series. So I think the rule of thumb is that after a large double-digit increase, it is expected that you will see a decline, a significant decline in the following year, sort of a correction, what you might think of as a market correction if you were looking at financial data. Next slide, please. Thank you. From 2009 to 2018, net returns stayed between negative 350 million and negative 241 million. So it was in a pretty small band and it was pretty consistent year after year. But in the last couple of years, we've seen some dramatic changes. Some of those changes were driven by tax law changes. Some of them were driven by things in the economy. The slowdowns that we've seen in the market shutdowns have affected employment, and employment has in turn caused people to both decrease their employment mid-year, which caused their end of year tax return to have a net effect of a positive effect because they didn't get the full withholding amount relative to what their tax liability was. Net returns forecast is a huge shift away from FY20 and FY21, which are outliers. The FY22 estimate includes the elimination of $93 million in UI income, which I mentioned earlier. It also includes an adjustment for new workers employed during the current business cycle expansion. And we expect a net decrease in net returns by these two effects to show up in the April net returns amounts. Next slide, please. Fiduciary, I mentioned earlier that we expect it to remain positive, but small going forward. In fiscal 21, up until the very end of the fiscal year, fiduciary was poised to end the year positive, but very small. But then there was one taxpayer had a refund that was substantial. I can't tell you exactly what it was, but it was between -$2 million and -$1 million that caused the net effect that you see there of -$800,000. So it would have been positive had it not been for that one large refund. Otherwise, this is a 3-year moving average model going forward, small but positive. Next slide, please. And here you can see the combination of all 4 of the components of the individual. It also includes the legislation impacts. So the legislation impacts were done post models. But here, these figures, both the control pessimistic and optimistic figures, include the legislation passed in the last 2 regular sessions. One thing that consoles me after I do my models, I like to compute what the withholding share of total individual is. Historically, this is a very consistent figure that runs between 92% and 94%. It's been historically pretty stable. In the last 2 years, as you might imagine, it's been considerably different than that. It was 88% in the last 2 years. So there was some anomaly in the last 2 years. However, in the five years going forward, the number was between 92 and 93%, which makes me feel pretty confident about the withholding numbers and the offsetting other 3 accounts. The biggest difference here is between the control and the pessimistic in FY26, which is just $114 million. The low growth in FY22 is due to legislation impacts, which muted the impact of all of the models in all 4 scenarios. Next slide. Let's take a look at these are just the individual income tax impacts. And so you can see since the numbers are pretty consistent in all 5 years, so what we really are seeing is a drop in all of the 5 forecast years. And that's where you're seeing for the FY22. Could you go back 1 slide, Michael, for a second? So if you look in FY22, you can see that dampening effect in FY22 across the board. So the legislation impacts are dampening what the model is putting out for the 4 accounts in FY22, and then very slightly dampening the effects in FY23. And then there's almost no effect from the legislation in 24, 25, and 26, in the sense that the changes in the nominal changes in the impacts in 23 and 24 are very similar. So there wouldn't be a growth change. It would just be a shifting down of the curve. So that concludes my individual income tax comments. If there's any comments, any questions, I'll take them now.
Thomas, I have one.
Sure.
I know at the end, we're going to get to the Excel spreadsheet where we start talking about, consensus, optimistic, pessimistic. So
Sure.
In the numbers that we have and in the Excel spreadsheet, these legislative adjustments, they are baked in. Is that right? So the number, I guess I'm just asking, you're telling us that you've made legislative adjustments.
Yes, sir.
And
Michael, could you go back 2 slides?
When we see the final number, that we don't have to worry about it. These have
Yes, sir.
already been baked in.
Right. Yes, sir. The legislative impacts are in all of those numbers. Yes, sir.
Okay. I just want to make sure. So if we have a problem with what we think the legislative adjustments are, we can talk about it, but otherwise
Sure.
they are in all the numbers.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to coal. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of history of coal. FY18 was the final year of a 6-year consecutive decline, large declines for coal. FY19, I guess you can think of that as sort of a dead cat bounce after falling so far from its FY12 historical record of $298 million. The FY20 figure includes the many shutdown consequences. As firms shut down, less electricity was used. And as a result, the amount of coal consumed also declined. Now, if you imagine for a moment, go back to the first quarter, January. Let's say you're sitting in January of 2020, and you know that this recession is coming, and you have to figure out whether the decline in industrial electricity usage when workers stay at home, if the industrial usage decline is going to be less than, the same, or greater than all of those employees who go home and use more electricity at home. I was really unsure back in January of 2020 what that sign was going to be. We now know what the effect was. The net effect was a decline of 36% on total coal usage. The people who stayed at home used more electricity than they previously did, while businesses that shut down went from 100% to 0%. The net effect, of course, resulted in 36% less collections and another 31% decline in the first quarter of FY21. So in the last 3 quarters, things seem to have turned around as businesses started to reopen and people who were working at home went back to work. 2 of the last 3 quarters have seen double-digit increases in coal usage. Some of the businesses like movie theaters have reopened, for example. IHS Markit believes that this increase in demand, commensurate with the increase in prices, will persist for the next 3 years and then taper off. We'll take a look at that in a moment. The July 2021 receipts just came out a couple of days ago. Receipts for coal were up by 54%. That was with a low base for compared to July of 2020, and also with very high demand for coal. Next slide, please. Here's a summary of some of the energy market information about what Global Insight, or what IHS Markit is saying about the various energy prices. I use all of these in my model. I'll get to that in a moment. You can see the coal prices are rising through 2025, the first quarter of 2025. This is just a summary. We'll take a close look at each of these energy markets in just a second. Next slide, please. This is a very similar methodology to what I've used in the past. The first 3 variables there are the usual culprits. That's the producer price index for coal, the West Texas Intermediate price of oil, and the Henry Hub price of natural gas. Those have been used in my models many times in the past. However, this quarter, U.S. personal income performed better as the income component of this demand model than what I've used in the past. Some of the other income components that I've used in the past, real GDP, you've seen me use many times. I've also used real consumer expenditures. All 3 of those have performed very well, and those other two performed well this time, but U.S. personal income performed the best. Next slide, please. Here we can see the producer price index for coal in its forecast. You can see that the optimistic and control lie nearly on top of each other, and you can see the increase in prices for the next 3 years going forward, and then they begin to taper off after 24. The pessimistic is very similar until the end of calendar 24, and then it starts to diverge. Next slide, please. For West Texas Intermediate, you can see that Global Insight is saying very similar things about all three scenarios. They're very similar, but the control scenario still lies south of the control, and the optimistic does lie north of the control. There's also no notable growth in the last 4 years of the forecast. Next slide, please. Natural gas prices, you can see that they're slightly tapering in all 5 years of the forecast, and all three scenarios lie nearly on top of each other, even out to FY26. Next slide, please. And here's the personal income series. Again, control and optimistic are nearly on top of each other, and they diverge a little bit in the FY23 and 24 periods, and then they converge back towards each other by FY26. All three scenarios show solid growth throughout the 5-year forecast horizon. Next slide, please. There's some solid growth in FY22 coming off of a very low base. Then some small declines for the next 4 years of the forecast horizon. The control and optimistic are similar. They differ by only $9 million in FY26. While the pessimistic is only half of the control. So there's a considerable difference in FY26 between the pessimistic and the control. The control is just a $26.9 million in FY26, while the control is just above 50 million. Again, these have all of the, there was one tax law legislation that impacted coal. It was approximately $1.5 million, and that is already included in these figures, and they had very little impact. Most of this is economic impacts. And that's all I have to share for coal.
If there's no questions about coal, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the sales tax. The first couple bullets I've already mentioned, so I won't belabor them. But when the CFG met on December 4th last year, sales tax growth through November was a fairly robust 6.3%. However, after the meeting, sales tax grew 16.4% from December to June fiscal 21. So that led to the error in the forecast. In terms of monthly data, let me just say real quickly, there've only been 7 months in the history of sales tax where we received over $400 million in a month. 5 of those have happened in calendar year 2021. So we've really seen some of the stimulus put to good use in the sales tax in calendar year 2021, including July, which was also over $440 million. So we've really seen a bust out in sales, and I'll talk more about the separation of the cyclical and the stimulus related effects in just a second. There is a lot of noise in the sales tax data right now. One of the things that is noisy is the sales tax base has been expanding, especially since 2018, 2019. We've been adding services, mainly in 2018, we added a bunch of services, and then 2019, we tweaked that. We've been aggressively taxing online sales, which was handy during the pandemic for the stay-at-home initiatives. And we've just in general slowly been changing from an income-based taxation state to a consumption-based taxation state. We'll see if that trend continues, but Kentucky did receive considerable amounts of federal stimulus above the projected amounts in the form of direct stimulus checks, unemployment insurance, payroll protection, and other exogenous spending relative to the federal aid. I guess my point is the first bullet the base expansion is structural and it will persist. The second bullet is transitory. And the challenge in forecasting was separating those two factors from one another. This slide may be difficult for you to read on your screen. It's in your packet and hopefully a little bit more clear in your packet. I just thought I'd give you a little granular data on sales tax by classification, by NAICS classification. And this slide shows some of the advancing sectors. The top three made up, close to 200 or 330, $230 million in growth in the sales tax. Non-store retailers, which is the internet plus some additional non-store retailers. Another one was talked about, I think, earlier, building materials and garden equipment supply dealers, Lowe's, Home Depots, et cetera. And then big growth, $41.5 million growth in general merchandise stores. 9% is a healthy growth rate, but it's a little bit below the total growth rate of the sales tax. So there's some gaudy growth rates on there. I just wanted to show you some of the advancing sectors during 21. And also to be complete, I wanted to show some of the declining sectors. Personal and laundry services, not surprisingly, with stay at home, got kind of hammered. They went from 69.6 million in 20 to 32.8 million in 21. That was a healthy difference of $36.9 million, or 53% loss in revenues from those services. And of course, accommodation and entertainment-based things had high negative growth rates and low collections. I just thought that I didn't use this data specifically in my forecast. I just thought it would be of interest to you all to see some granular data. In terms of the taxation of our two statutorily defined internet things, marketplace providers and remote retailers. Marketplace providers have been taxed since July of 2019. Remote retailers have been taxed since July 1st of 2018 versus the July 1st of 2019 for the marketplace retailers. You can see for fiscal 21, the combined amount of internet sales that we got was 265.6 million compared to fiscal 20 when we only received 166.4 million. Those were both higher than the estimate for those sources of income, and not surprisingly grew quite a bit, especially during the earlier part of the fiscal year. In terms of updating the sales tax estimate, I really rolled up my sleeves this time because the 12.0% growth really puzzled me. So I contacted several state sales tax experts and some of my colleagues who are econometric experts, and talked to them about, I talked to Bill Fox, for example, concerning the fast growth of sales tax in Tennessee, and what he was doing from a modeling standpoint, and talked to some econometric experts on what I could do econometrically to pick up this recent volatility and the growth of transfer payments. And everybody agreed that it was crucial somehow to account for the stimulus money. So I tried, the normal suspects, and then I used some different estimating techniques. But in general, I reran the structural models, the ARIMA model and the VAR model that I had used in the past, and I tried some new specifications. I really wanted to get Kentucky transfer payments as a variable that was significant, because I think that the 12% had a lot to do with Kentucky federal transfer payments that were received. Unfortunately, that variable was not significant regardless of the sample size. I thought maybe if I truncated the sample size, I could get that baby to come in, but it was not significant. It got better with the shorter sample size, but the p-values never got close to being significant. So I wasn't able to use Kentucky transfer payments as a reliable variable. Neither was the dummy variable. The dummy variable was not coming in. And I talked to some folks on how to populate that dummy variable, and I still couldn't get it to come in as a significant factor. So I was left with structural models, VARs, and ARIMAs. So in terms of structural models, I tried some income variables, Kentucky wages, Kentucky personal income, and of course the US counterparts to those. There's a variable that IHS puts out called US state and local personal taxes. That variable fits very well with the sales tax history, and that was a standalone structural model that I used as one of the 4 models that I blended. I also used consumer spending variables like durables and non-durables, and US retail sales. I usually blend a VAR, but this time the VAR was not coming in. The cross terms, I did a VAR in levels because there was co-integration with the sales tax and Kentucky personal income tax. The problem was on the sales tax variable, none of the personal income lagged variables were significant, and I went up to 8 lags and I still couldn't get significance. So I had to scrap the VAR. I did use a theoretical Box-Jenkins ARIMA model as one of the 4 in the control forecast. Ultimately, I adopted a blend of 4 models, and I used generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity estimation instead of OLS because I talked to some econometric experts, and they recommended that with the increased residual values and so forth. So instead of using OLS, I used either ARCH or GARCH models. And you can see on the control, I blended 4 models. On the optimistic and pessimistic, I only blended 3 because I didn't feel it was kosher to use an ARIMA model in those blends. So those 2 models, the optimistic and pessimistic, don't include an ARIMA, so they're only a blend of 3. What you see is a predictable pattern, the control in the middle. The optimistic has some, especially some short-term upside to the control, and the pessimistic is lower. It does, if you look, there's a subtle slope increase in 25 and 26, which you'll see on my growth rate chart, but that's a graphical depiction of the sales tax forecast. One of the variables I used was, let me catch up because I can't see the title like Michael had. This looks like consumer spending on other durable goods. And you can see that from the high peak, we had declines and then eventually growing again. That variable was significant in my diagnostic. So that was one of the regressors that I used. This is retail sales, the census data on retail sales, including food service. And you can see the somewhat predictable spread between control optimistic and pessimistic. And here is the sales tax forecast graphically, the control, the optimistic and the pessimistic. And you can, I was looking at the wrong graph before, I apologize. This is the one where you can see the slope of the pessimistic rising at the end. I got a slide ahead of myself earlier. I'm sorry, I can't read the titles on my screen, but here's the sales tax forecast in graphical form. And here's what it looks like, the control forecast in a column chart format. Coming off that high hurdle at 12%, we're still expecting growth this year, but lower growth, 4.9%. And then low to mid historical growth in 23 through 26 in the control at least. And here is a tabular view of the forecast. Unlike income tax and the coal forecast, there's some fairly substantial variation between your bounds here. Like if you look at fiscal 24, the optimistic forecast is 5.3 billion, and the pessimistic is 4.8 billion. So there's a $500 million swing between optimistic and pessimistic in the sales tax forecast. Even in the current fiscal year, fiscal 22, the optimistic's 4.9 versus 4.67 billion in terms of your band. So the choice of control optimistic and pessimistic is somewhat consequential on the sales tax, since there is such a fairly substantial difference between the estimates. I think that's all I have on the sales tax. I did try different estimation techniques, different variables. Tried my best to get the noise from the U.S. transfer payments out of the data, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to keep working on that, because I couldn't do it through dummy variables, and I couldn't do it through using a predetermined or exogenous variable transfer payments. They were not significant. So I did my best, and that's my forecast for the sales tax. And I'll pause here for questions before handing it off to Gene Zapranic-Brown for the corporate tax forecast.
Did you consider at all simply dropping that one outlier year and seeing if you can smooth through it? It's just that the shock is so big. They're going to cause the error bounds to cross probably all three models, or pull your model up one way or the other away from the long run trends. You might try some smoothing through that section and see what the alternatives are.
Thank you. I will try that. We do know the approximate amounts of the transfer payments, and while a sales tax is not, we don't know receipts by what's from a transfer payment and what's from normal cyclical data. So I can't do it directly, but I sure can try to even that out a little bit by deducting, using a marginal propensity to consume out of transfer payments. I can probably smooth that out and then put it back in. So thank you, Professor. I'll try that for October, definitely. Give that a shot, because that 12.1 does throw off the 12% growth in fiscal 21. That is really creates havoc in the econometrics. Thank you for the suggestion.
I wouldn't consider myself an econometrics expert, but have you considered putting a step function in there with some sort of not exponential decay or something like that? Because that would account for the jump and then let it slowly come back down based on your assumptions of how fast people are spending. I do know that the savings rate jumped at that time and then fell. It's practically back to normal, and credit cards are being paid off. So they're not spending it all right away. So I was just wondering if maybe that would help.
I'm not really too conversant in step functions, but I will look into that. Let me write that down. And Professor Hernandez's suggestion. And I'll definitely try those two methods and report back to you in October when we have our meeting.
And Greg, both of those comments, I think, come back to a little bit of what I asked about before. I mean, you've said it just now. We're forecasting a 12% growth, right? And I think I understand why, because last year was low, you know, because we were really in the heart of COVID starting on July 1st of last year. And now, you know, we're somewhat out of it. And so I guess, again, I'm coming back to I don't know if it's because of the rate of growth, but when we just had a presentation on wages and salaries, I know not a lot of this is also coming from these payments, you know, that we had previously that we may not have in the past, new stimulus payments and PPP and so on. But if the wages and salaries, it looks like the difference between optimistic and control and pessimistic seem quite low. So unless we think that we're going to get a whole lot new PPP loans or extended stimulus or something, it looks like it would be tighter. So I believe that I don't have any suggestions. I think the last two were good ones, but I'm just wondering why it's so far, why there's so much variation in the big picture. If you can just maybe take just a moment, try to explain to me why there's so much variation when we expect wages to be pretty close, and yet we haven't heard anything. It sounds like in the control scenario of we're expecting a whole lot of new stimulus money.
I did examine the big difference in fiscal 24, because a $500 million swing between forecast is fairly substantial swing, and I tried to dissect which variables were causing that swing, and it was the retail sales variable had the biggest variation between control, optimistic, and pessimistic. But I can get you a disaggregation of, you know, because I blend, I can see which models have the biggest differences. I can report back to you, but I don't know off the top of my head which precise variable is causing the difference to get as big as it is. But
anything to do with blending the alternative scenarios don't include the time series.
Yeah, Gene pointed out something that may be a factor as well. The ARIMA model in the control forecast is a stabilizing factor, and it sort of comes in the middle of all the structural models. And I didn't have that stabilizing factor in the optimistic and pessimistic forecast. So I think that's a factor as well. And
that sounds good. I think that would be helpful for me for the next time we meet. I like that idea. If you can just give us maybe just a few high points of like, I think it's this variable or this one, because you're right, 500 is a big difference between the two. And we don't, you know, behavior is changing with people. Maybe in a few months, we'll know more about whether new stimulus is going to be in the pipeline in the next couple of years. And we can look at how people responded to the last stimulus, and, you know, maybe we'll guess, you know, a year out, we'll have a new one. So yeah, if you could just maybe for October or whenever to just kind of have just the top 2 or 3 that you think are making that big swing, that would be helpful to me. So thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm going to turn it over to Gene Zapranic Brown now to go over the corporation tax.
Good morning. Typically, when
when we had made the change in the forecasting methodology, when we had switched from estimating the corporate and the LLET tax separately to a combined method, we had done a pretty good job of estimation. If you look at what happened last year, there was a significant difference between the actual and the estimate. In fact, the estimate was well under the actual of $335 million. So we talked about it internally and talked to the Department of Revenue, and there are a number of reasons of what might be happening here. One Greg mentioned was there's been a lot of tax law changes, which creates a lot of uncertainty with the receipts. The corporate tax is pretty volatile. We do our best to get a handle on what those estimated fiscal impacts are, but I think under the corporate tax, that's one of the harder ones to really get a handle on. There's significant timing differences with that. Also, of course, the economy did better than was forecasted. There was a significant amount of the federal funds relief that came in. Also, with a good stock market, the capital gains were doing better than probably anticipated. And then lastly, the Department of Revenue let us know that there were a couple of taxpayers who in previous years had each paid about $1 million in taxes, and last year made estimated payments of close to $80 million. So that's one account that we're looking at. It's possible, given the excess amount of, or seemingly excess amount of estimated payments that were made, that may be coming out in refunds in the coming years. This is a history of the corporate receipts over the last few years. You can see kind of two different regimes from fiscal 12 through fiscal 15, where we had double-digit increases in the taxes in 3 of the 4 years, and then very low growth over the next 4 years. And of course, fiscal 20, a decline of 16%, and then the last year, a large increase. Part of that percentage change, of course, is because of the 20 receipts were so low, but we've already seen that the dollar increase was fairly significant. And again, this is the procedure we've used. It's what I've used in the past, mainly the idea of combining the corporate and the LLET tax and forecasting it as a single series. I use U.S. Profits before tax as my regressor. And this is the IHS market U.S. corporate profits forecast. You can see the big dip in 20. The other thing to notice is in the forecast, not only is it increasing, but profits are going to be at a higher level than we had in the past. That'll roll into our forecast. Also, I made the adjustments to the forecast for the fiscal impacts. This is the payroll payroll protection issue that Greg talked about earlier. You'll notice that, well, this can be divided between the corporate and the individual income tax. The majority of it shows up in the corporate tax. The first 2 years are $120 million and $134 million. The out years, it's about half of that. So you'll see a difference in the growth rate when you look at the forecast. That has to do with the amount, primarily with the amount that we're subtracting off of the forecast. That'll have an impact on the growth rate. So the forecast you'll see for fiscal 22 declines in all 3 of the scenarios, mainly due to the fiscal impact change, small increases in 23, and then a larger increase in 24, 25, and 26, moderate changes. So that's the corporation income tax forecast. Shall I move on to property taxes? Is there any questions? Oh, there's one more here. This is you can just see the dip. We had the dip in 20, the big increase in 21, another dip in 22, and then increases over the forecast horizon.
What is driving the dip in 22?
The big difference is the fiscal impact change on there. It was $120 million we're subtracting off the receipt, and then another $130 million in 23, and then in the 50s and 60s in the other. So this is the property tax actual versus estimated for last year. We missed it. Underestimated the forecast by $38 million or 5.8%. The majority of that is in the motor vehicle. Sales were much stronger than anticipated, and some of that money was from the prior fiscal year that rolled over into the current year. The tangible also had a significant difference in real. While the difference was only $4 million, we did exceed 4%. That grew at 4.4% for the year. This is again looking at property tax receipts over the last several years. There are a couple of outliers in 14 and 15. Those were relatively low. That was a time when the real income grew at about 0.5% in each of those years. Also, part of the increase that you see in 13 was due to amnesty, where we had omitted tangible receipts of about $10 million, which suppressed the omitted and delinquent receipts in those prior years. Then the next several years, we were 3.5% to 4% growth. And in 20, we only dropped about 0.5% and then grew significantly last year at 9.3%. And some of that money, of course, was money from fiscal 20 that came over, particularly, as I said, the motor vehicle. And here's the forecast for the property tax. So for 22, it's going to be about a little over 1%. And then in the final years, roughly about the average of the prior years. And we can look at some of the accounts to see what's happening. So let's look at the real property. The important things to notice, Greg had mentioned, is that the tax rate is being lowered for the first time since 2008 from 12.2 cents per $100 of assessed value to 11.9%. And here is the forecast. And again, as I said last year, real grew at 4.4%. We have that growing at 4.2% and slowly coming down to 3.7%. Now I want to spend a little time talking about House Bill 44 because, as you're aware, that limits property growth, real property growth to 4% annually. So how can we have a forecast that exceeds that? So it's important to understand how that works. And when they say that limits revenue to 4%, they don't look at the receipts report and say, okay, in fiscal 21, we grew 4.4%, therefore the tax rate needs to be lower to account for that. So what they do is, and how the tax rate is calculated, and what they mean when they look at 4% is, it's based on what they call allowable revenue. And to get to allowable revenue, they take total real property assessments, and they take out of that, this was on the real property, which are residential, farm, and commercial property. They take out new property and properties subject to tax increment financing. And then to get the rate, they take that adjusted assessments, multiply it by the current tax rate, And they can make other adjustments for exonerations, which would be errors on tax bills and excess collections. I'll talk about excess collections in a minute. Then they grow that allowable revenue by 4% to get to the current year. Then they take that and divide it by the new property assessments to get a tax rate. So what they mean is for allowable revenue or for the adjustment of the rate, we look at the allowable revenue from the prior year and the current year, and if that exceeds 4%, then they make an adjustment. So even though we collected 4.4%, or in real property tax revenues increased 4.4%, there wasn't an adjustment last year for excess revenues. So again, how, and that's the other thing to keep in mind is that's based on gross revenue. And so how can we still get property that a property forecast that's going to exceed 4%? The big thing there is you have to keep in mind that when they back out the new and the TIF property, those properties are still taxable. So even though the rate discounts those or excludes that value, those are taxable properties. And so last year we had a large increase in the TIF and the new property from approximately $5.7 billion to $8.6 billion. So the other thing to keep in mind is that's looking at gross revenues when we report net revenues. So net revenues, of course, there's adjustments for cost of collection fees for the sheriffs. There's discount 2% in the first 30 days. They get a 2% discount on that. And then there's non-payments and things like that. So that's how we're going to get a forecast of greater than 4% in the next couple of years. We're going to have this new property and this TIF property that's going to remain fairly high, that's excluded from the rate setting process, but will be accounted for in the revenues. This is the tangible property forecast, or the forecast. We can see some history. So fiscal 21 was 6.7%. The forecast is lower than that. We had some additional money from 20 into 21. And so the forecast is going to be slightly lower than what we had in previous years. Motor vehicle were quite strong in 21. We had a lot of auto sales, but also you can see the 6.9% decline in fiscal 20. Some of that money rolled into 21. Taxpayers were given 90-day extensions and to pay those bills. Offices were closed or it was difficult to make those payments. So the fourth quarter, some of that property tax came into 21. So we'll see a slight decline in 22 and then strong growth in 23 and falling slightly over the next several years as motor vehicle sales continue to be strong. The omitted and delinquent, the forecast is basically just an average of the prior years. We know that it was strong in 21, and you expect that from the pandemic, and so we're just taking an average there. Public service property tax, you see increases and decreases in seemingly alternate years. A lot of that has to do with the protests. A portion of that tax is typically protested, and then it, when it's determined whether that is taxes liable, that's paid, so it can get lumpy. There was also in that history some changes in who was subject to the public service company tax. We had small growth last year of 2.2%. We have a decline this year, and then 0.7% increase in each of the other years. This is the other property. It's a number of accounts. It's quite small. We've been in the range of just over $2 million, and the forecast has it slightly declining in each of the years. And so in fiscal 22, 1.2% growth, and then 3 to 3.5% growth in each of the other fiscal years. That's the property tax.
Thanks, Chief.
I've got the remainder of the general fund accounts, smaller accounts, so I'm going to give them a smaller amount of time. The cigarette tax, we changed the rate from 60 cents to $1.10 in fiscal 19, yet fiscal 20 on a revenue neutral basis actually grew. We had higher number of tax revenue in fiscal 20 than we did on fiscal 19 on a rate neutral basis. However, we reverted back to a more normal pattern in fiscal 21. Tax revenue was down 1.4%. By historical standards, that's not much of a decline, but we did decline last year, which is sort of the expectation for cigarettes. I think one of the reasons we did see a decrease was discounting is beginning to abate and counter prices are rising on cigarettes, and either affects your number of sticks per day, or you see some movement down the product line. Instead of buying the expensive cigarettes, people buy the cheaper ones. So we're seeing some movement down the product lines. Kentucky is seeing some consumption declines, but not as great a declines as you see in some of the national and U.S. average data. So we know that we're going to have consumption declines. We just don't think it's going to be at the rate that the nation drops. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can forecast cigarettes. I'm using the monthly data because I'm only using stuff at the $1.10 tax rate. So I've been using monthly data to forecast cigarettes. So since there's such a different number of ways to do an atheoretical movement of monthly data, I did a control optimistic pessimistic this time. I'm not going to get used to that. I'll probably just do for October and December, I'll probably try to come up with the best methodology and not do a control optimistic pessimistic. But as you can see, there's not a huge range in the estimates for the cigarette tax. The control, you have rates of every year, the revenues decline anywhere between 1.7% and 2.2%. In the pessimistic, the rate declines are a little sharper, between 2.3 and 3.4% for the various years. So we're seeing declines more steep than the current year, the 1.4% in the current year, but not as steep as some of the national figures that I've been seeing thrown about. Again, I did a control optimistic pessimistic this time, but in October, I'll probably come up with a preferred model and just present it, because there's not a lot of variation between the three models, and they're all atheoretical modeling techniques. So that's the cigarette tax. We know it's a fairly simple tax to forecast in terms of you're probably going to get a decline. It's probably going to be, you never miss this forecast by very much because the declines have been fairly predictable except for the increase in fiscal 20. So not a lot of variation to talk about on the cigarette tax forecast. So I'm going to move along to the Kentucky Lottery because the Kentucky Lottery had a banner year in fiscal 21. Their biggest revenue source is instant tickets, and the sales went up 29.8% and contributed 961.7 of the roughly $1.586 billion worth of ticket sales. The ticket sales went up by that large amount because they've been innovative in the amount in the number of products they offer. They've got a $30 and a lot of new $20 scratch off tickets that you can purchase, and that's increased sales 29.8%. The draw games are a little bit more profitable, especially the Mega Millions and the Powerball, very profitable sources of dividend. They were up 17.9% from fiscal 20, and they contribute roughly a third of the total sales. While it's a small player, $118.6 million total, iLottery, the instant lottery, the instant play internet lottery, grew 256.7%, and it looks like that the COVID pandemic was the iLottery provided people an outlet for gaming activity during the pandemic, and the Kentucky Lottery seems to think that they'll be able to retain those customers, so sales will not drop off from that peak. It's expected. Total ticket sales were up 31.8%. Total prizes, the bottom bullet, were up 33.2%, which implies to me that in order to get ticket sale growth, we've had to be more competitive on our prizes to get people to play more, which is good business sense. So we did see good growth in the dividend, up to 270, up from 271.4 million in fiscal 20 to 289.1 million in general fund dividend in 21. However, the actual dividend was 347.1 million, and there was a directive language in the budget bill that said that you could keep the first $3 million of money over the 286.1 estimate. You keep that in the general fund, and the remainder would be put into a reserve account for future appropriation. So the general fund number that you see on the receipts report is 289.1, but the actual dividend, total dividend that came from the Kentucky Lottery was 347.1 million. Quite a spectacular year. And you can see the forecast for dividend transfers and ticket sales. Ticket sales are going to continuously rise. The dividend's going to dip in fiscal 22, primarily due to the mixture of sales that we're going to have in terms of offering the higher, getting growth from the higher prize payout items. So we do expect a dividend transfer dip from 21 to 22, but then steady growth going forward. Here's a graphical depiction of what we think the lottery is going to get. And again, I'm showing the 347.1 is the last history instead of the 289.1, which is the general fund portion. So we are going to see, I guess the biggest question I continue to have on the lottery forecast is why the dip from 347 to 319 when we do have slight growth in ticket sales. And the main dialogue that I'm having with the Kentucky Lottery Corporation, they have good people there, and they've been telling me it's it's the mixture of sales that makes the dividend fall, even though we're growing sales ever so slightly. We'll continue to have discussions up through October and December to get the latest numbers, but for now, those are the numbers that the Kentucky Lottery Board have looked at and approved. So that's your lottery forecast. The miscellaneous and other taxes, it's about $800 million worth of revenue. They grew 78.9 million in fiscal 21, or 10.4%. Several of the larger tax accounts in other grew sharply. Alcohol taxes make up a big chunk. They grew 9.2%. They responded well to the stay-at-home. We had a lot of, especially distilled spirit, wholesale tax grew very sharply. Other tobacco products grew 86.1 or 86.0%, excuse me, and that was because we started to tax vaping products, and that actually I missed that forecast. I did not predict that the vaping products would generate the kind of revenue that they did, but they as you can see, nearly doubled the revenues for other tobacco products. The pari-mutuel tax grew 98%, and that's primarily historical horse racing tax growth, number of positions, days open, etc. It grew 98%, and we expect growth in that in the future as well. But historical horse racing is what's driving the 98.0% growth there. Telecom taxes were up 8.6%, and that's mainly streaming video. So that again was another stay-at-home play in terms of tax revenues, 8.6% growth in streaming video, especially. And abandoned property grew 19.5%. The reasons for the growth, I've already kind of touched on, but several of the taxes had a reduced base from fiscal 20. Especially that last quarter drug down some of the taxes in fiscal 20, and then some of the accounts benefited from either stay-at-home activity or reopening towards the latter stages of fiscal 21, especially I'm thinking especially the pari-mutuel tax for the reopening play and the stay-at-home. I'm thinking kind of the alcohol and telecommunications taxes. So good growth. My forecast for some of the larger taxes you can see in this table of data. Basically, every major tax in other, I've predicted growth. Still working on nailing the exact pari-mutuel forecast. I had it a little bit higher, than I lowered it a little bit. There's more positions coming online for historical horse racing terminals. So we're trying to really hone in on when those new terminals will become available, and when the historical horse racing at the different venues will increase. And then we have a spreadsheet that converts the number of positions into a general fund portion of the tax. So there's the forecast for some of the larger taxes in the other category, and here's the aggregate forecast. The thing that struck me when I looked at this table, a couple things struck me. The dip between 21 and 22 struck me, but then I remembered that the bank franchise tax was paid in fiscal 21. Even though the tax was repealed, and we don't expect the bank in fact, it won't be paid in fiscal 22. So that's about $120 million drop in that tax. So that's why it drops from 21 and 22. And the reason the other thing that struck me was the little growth between 22 and 23. And part of that is the $15 million security sale that we're going to have on some securities that are abandoned property to the state. That adds about $15 million to estimated to fiscal 22. So without that, we would have seen a lower number in 22 and then sort of more normal growth in 23 through 26. But, you know, there's about 60 accounts. We go through them pretty carefully. Don't use a lot of structural models and heavy econometrics. It's more contacting agencies, talking it through, and seeing you know, there's a lot of accounts like court cost and fees and stuff like that are annual data that don't lend themselves to the rigorous econometric viewpoints, but we pick up the phone and call the relative agencies and get our forecast that way. So really, that's what we have for the other receipts forecast, and that I think rounds out the general fund. At this point, we typically pause, and
I think we should probably break for 10 minutes and let people stand up and walk around, please, even at home.
okay, and when you come back, Mr. Chairman, we'll have the spreadsheet for the general fund open, and we can talk about your preferred blending if you want to do some blending. So, you know, why don't we take 10 and come back?
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Turn off the feed and stuff.
Does anyone need more water?
No, thank you.
We're not sure why. I don't know. Not sure how Zoom decides how many people to put up there.
When I was at home, it was like 12.
Yeah. I don't know.
I like that.
Mr. Chairman, are you ready to resume? You're on mute, sir.
He says, am I on mute?
Yes, you're on mute.
Okay,
There you
Yes,
go.
sir.
all right, so yes, I think if people are back, but give people a couple of minutes maybe.
Okay.
People are showing up here.
Greg, this isn't related to the forecast, but do you know where your offices are going to be in the near future?
That's a good question, sir. No, we don't know, to make a long story short. But General Assembly's had their eyes on that space for some time. And so us and the whole West Wing is gone, including finance and OFM down in the basement. So
I hope you get some state-of-the-art facilities with good views to maximize the forecasting accuracy.
well, thank you. I hope you're right, and I hope it does help the forecasting accuracy. No,
Well,
they haven't.
I'll take the pessimistic on that forecast.
So you've been chucked out of the Capitol Annex?
Yes, sir. Effective December 1.
That's awful.
Well, yeah, yes, sir. It'll make life a little tougher, especially during the legislative session.
Okay, Greg, why don't we go ahead?
Okay, well, if I didn't thank you at the beginning for your service, I thank you now. That was a lot of material to go through on the general fund. What you see before you is the blend sheet. I can do different weights, however you want, and it blends them on the fly. What you're seeing right now is the control forecast at 100% weight. You heard the different analysts tell what we thought 22 through 26, but this is the first real chance to look at it put together, and put together fiscal 22 on the control scenario of 0.9%. And you can see the growth rates and so forth. But remember the IHS market blend was 50, 30, 20, 50 control, 30 optimistic, and 20 on the pessimistic were the weights that IHS used in their presentation of the material. if you want to go tax by tax or just talk about whether the assumptions of the control optimistic, pessimistic, if you found one more compelling than the other, we can maybe, try to work from there.
So do we have opinions on this?
I guess the big question is how different the conventional is to the optimistic, since you have those two weird dynamics that are occurring, right? One is occurring later than the other, where you have this increase it's happening more eminently, and then followed by that decrease, whereas in the control, you kind of just have this more gradual change. I'm not placing as much weight on the pessimistic. Am I wrong to be thinking this? Am I too overly optimistic on this?
But I also wonder, I think I remember this right. The most recently passed legislation, so all legislation passed at the federal level, they cut off basically in March or so. So more recent stuff has not been, is that the case? The infrastructure packages and whatnot, that's not factored into this?
That's correct, yes.
That's what, 3 trillion?
Yeah.
No, that's 1.9, or no, 1 point.
A trillion here, a trillion there.
Yes.
I don't know where Kentucky would be relative in that. Right? What does that do to us? I don't know.
Well, the census numbers came out yesterday for registering, or 12, and said that we grew about 3.8%, but we're still at over 90% household occupancy. That makes you think there's got to be more at least household manufacturing coming down the pipe at some point. If not, we're just getting more and more concentrated dwellings, and where are these people going? So that's why I thought we'd be a little bit different from the U.S. numbers on housing, just because there's got to be some catch up occurring there. It's not big, right? It's probably on the order of 1 to 2%, but it's still there, and it's still a real number. It's not a small number in terms of the levels.
You think COVID had any change in individuals' preferences for home ownership? People wanting to spread out? You're asking where they came from. Are they moving from rental to home ownership?
I don't know if it changed their preferences so much. I know I've heard some people say that they were happy they didn't downsize. That they enjoyed the extra space there. The other thing that comes to mind with some of these projections is just the behavioral change. A lot of these are responses to being stuck at home, and then once they go more mobile again, we're gonna see a flip. We're gonna see a flip on those expenditures. You saw the 780% increase in courier mail and things of that nature. Like, that's all going down, if it's not down already. There's going to be a change in those attitudes. Some of it will still stick around. I think we will all still continue to use Amazon way too much. I think those will continue, but expenditures in entertainment, I think lottery it's got to come down a little bit. Or I haven't played the lotto in a long time. Maybe they are that much better, but I think those entertainment dollars will go elsewhere. They'll go back into restaurants, into accommodations, and away from these things that we would do if we were still stuck at home. Same thing with alcohol expenditures, things of that nature.
I agree with Jose if we are looking out several years, but just in the past couple months, I think we've seen a big shift in people's outlooks towards the immediate future, and I see more people withdrawing. I've been going to my office building most days this summer, and in the past couple or 3 weeks, I've noticed a lot fewer of my colleagues there. I don't know if it's because they're all on holiday now. I doubt it, since we're getting ready to start back up. Maybe they just don't want to hang around with other people, and people seem to be more reluctant to go out to eat now. And how long is this going to keep up? I don't know, but I think there's Greg, you and your colleagues have mentioned a lot of noise today in your presentations, and I think it's getting noisier over the next few months. I have no idea if that's going to translate into any changes in the longer term, or if once we are approaching herd immunity, we're just going to go back to the way it was before. I kind of doubt it. I think there's going to be more work from home, and that's going to have implications for our cities, I think. But how to put that into the forecast, you got me.
I think over the next few months, what happens with respect to younger children, the children under 11 or 12, and how that works out with schooling is going to have an important effect on the labor force. But that again is quite, between now and Christmas time, I guess, we know.
And we will get an acceleration towards herd immunity one way or the other. Right? Schools have started, so that means this is the week. This is the week when everything spreads. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen now. And then once you have colleges start opening up their doors, many are having face-to-face classes, no social distancing. You're going to see that increase in spread. Even if we get a shutdown, we're going to be pretty close to locally herd immunity just due to simple exposure rather than vaccinations alone. You would think the vaccinations would increase if we do see spikes, but exposure is coming one way or the other. Like, well, we know increased exposure is on the horizon. It'll be faster than what we've already seen, and we've already seen this uptick come up. Now, I don't see it reversing anytime until maybe around October, when people might start pulling back hard if there's a big uptick. But between then and now, you're going to get a lot more exposure in the elementary school level, bring that home to the parents, and at the college level, there's just going to be a lot more interactions than there were before.
I have a question for Greg. Do we have an idea how our revenue growth compared to other states?
I don't have every tax, but our sales tax was right near the median of other states. 12% growth you'd think would be very, very rapid, but there were a lot of states that did better than that, and a few states that did worse. But the 12% on sales tax was right at the median of the states that were surveyed. I looked at some data from the Federation of Tax Administrators, and we had a conference call talking about forecasting years, and every state across the board missed it on the low side in fiscal 21, and has seen consistent revenue growth just about like ours. I think the only tax that we were ahead on in terms of the median state was the corporate and the LLET in fiscal 21, but that was a function of the low base in 20 and so forth. So I every state is experiencing roughly what we're experiencing in terms of revenues coming in faster than expected, and especially on the sales tax and withholdings, which is 74% of the general fund.
Okay, do we see any strong reason from using something other than the control?
No, right now I'd be willing to go with control. I think optimistic just, it's not that different. And at least in terms of economic activity in the short run, I think it will continue to increase. So I don't think the pessimistic is the right call.
Yeah, optimistic brings you up from 0.9 to 2.5% growth, and pessimistic is would imply a negative growth rate for 22. So back to control at 0.9. I can do some blending if you'd like.
Frank, this is David. I guess Greg just illustrated what was going to be my comment, which is 22 seems awfully small. If there's anything we've learned in recent year, it should be that for whatever reason, things seem to be doing much better revenue-wise than forecasted. So when I looked in the longer term, these growth rates I don't have any issue with, but I just wonder whether the 22 number itself is perhaps too modest. I realize we're coming off of some big numbers, but I just look at the individual income tax only growing by $40 million plus. Well, yet we have sales taxes growing by $200 million. So it would seem that people ought to be spending money out of their wages and salaries are going toward income. But I just wonder whether we're too cautious in 22.
David, I think that's a great point. I guess I'm oftentimes maybe a little too pessimistic, but I guess what I would say is I'm kind of leaning towards the control number, and you're right, it's not very large, but in my mind, it's large in the sense that I think it was so large this past year, but I think from what we've been told, a large part of that's because we just had massive unemployment and direct stimulus money in. And I do think there's probably likely to be growth this year, but it will be growth based upon more homegrown growth. As you know, like if we don't get massive unemployment checks and if we don't get massive stimulus checks this year and we still spend more than last year, to me, that's quite a bit of growth from like an exaggerated, exaggerate is the wrong word, but a one-time change from last year of how much money. Now, if we find out in October or December that we're going to get a whole lot more stimulus money, maybe the numbers will be even more huge. But an increase from base wages from last year's big increase in transfer payments already seems to me to be a pretty big bump up.
I agree with your point.
I'm kind of like Alan. I tend to be a little more pessimistic. The other thing you have to factor in here is if they do hold with the October moratorium on eviction, at some point, some of that money that's been going into retail sales is going to have to go back to rent. So I would be, I'm more of the control. I think that's more comfortable with the 100% control, I think.
What's driving the 0.9 is the withdrawal of the federal transfers.
Of course, with, job openings right now are at historic highs, I believe. So these individuals should be able to move from unemployment into jobs pretty easily.
Well,
that we would hope, but
the numbers we have for wages and salaries are quite strong, but they're offset. If you look at the numbers, they're offset by this decline in transfers.
Right.
That's how you end up with this very strange, on the face of it, number for personal income.
employment's got to go up. I mean, we're still down. We're still down quite a bit. So you know, employment's going to increase with strong wages. You would think that to entice more people out. Janet makes a good point though about the rents coming back. That's a big deal though. That the disposable income decrease. So some of these additional expenditures that we're getting from sales taxes and other places might not be as high. It doesn't sound like I hear any votes towards pessimistic. Is there anyone who's rooting for optimistic or has some additional optimism?
Greg, could you show us if we went with the more of a control of 75 and optimistic of 25, what that looks like?
It brings the 0.9 just up to 1.3 with 25% optimistic. So you're buying in for 22, which seems to be the focus that you guys have right now. It brings you up 0.4%.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us?
Well, I'm certainly fine, Frank, with control. I was just observing that the nearer term might, for all the other problems we're struggling with, I agree the near term is probably even more challenging than the longer term for some reasons, but I just wondering whether we're being too cautious in the near term. I was fine with the longer term, but it's not a huge deal to me one way or the other.
Well, we do this again in October, right?
In December, yes, sir.
Well, I guess I would suggest, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say we missed it by quite a bit last year. And the models seem to just drop off like we've reached kind of a peak already. We're still going to have some of that impact from fiscal stimulus. Unemployment runs the extra checks run through September. We've got the tax credits that are they're the child tax credits that are being expanded out over the next year. So there's still some spending there to be had for a 1.3% growth.
They don't have factored in there any more stimulus that might come if any of the infrastructure bills are passed.
Of course, that assumes shovel-ready projects are ready.
Right. Right.
Well, and I don't know if how many of you saw Thomas's information in the chat just now. I mean, because really what he's saying is the number that from my question earlier, the numbers are already baked in for legislative impacts, that if they didn't take that into effect, the real rate is like over 2% growth. So instead of the 0.9, the real growth from these extra things is really 2.1, but the legislative impacts bring it down to 0.9. If I read your chat right, Thomas. So again, I think that there will be growth. And so I'm just trying to figure out is a real 2% growth high enough for the next year? If someone wants to argue it'll be even higher, I'm fine to listen, but 2% sounds like a pretty decent growth in real terms from this past year for the next 22 anyway, next 11 months.
Okay.
There's a way that if you wanted, we could either change 22 only to get it up, and then keep the keep the control for the out years, I can either do that, or we can add, if you want higher growth, and let me put it back to all control.
Yeah, if you could do optimistic for 22 and then all control for the rest, I'd like to see that.
Yeah, trying to think if I can do that on the fly.
But we can compare these numbers, right? So this is 100% control, and you could see the growth rate into the future. And then
Yeah.
if we changed just fiscal year 22, it went up to
Right.
what, 1.3? Yeah.
Yeah, so the fiscal 22 went up to the last three digits in the revenue were 92.2, so it went up about $50 million when it was 75.25.
If you want the straight optimistic in 22, that brings it up a little
At
bit more
2.5.
considerably,
Yeah.
to 2.5% growth. And I could do that for 22 and then use the control estimates for 23 through 26.
Those seem more reasonable to me. They'd all be in that 2% range or so. Yeah. Right, because it's 2.5 and 22, and then I believe in the control, the rest of them are in the 2.2s to 2.6s.
What? Yeah, it will affect the fiscal 23% change. But do you want me to try to do that here on the fly, to change 22 to optimistic, and then you want me to fix the growth rates for the future years, or just fix the values for the future years? You understand what I'm saying? Do you want for 20, if we make 22 optimistic, do you want 23 to be 2.3% over that, or do you want it to be 13,240.6?
I would say I would want the 13,240.6.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can do that real quick.
All right, because what we're trying to do is justify what's going to happen with these potential financial legislative shocks, but then think that it's all going to come back to an equilibrium. So they'll be realized in 22, but then we should start moving back in 23 in the out years.
How do you get that out of the way? Thank you. So your growth rate in 23 dips to 0.7 because we fixed it on the 240.6. But you do get to some of the concerns I've been hearing about the current fiscal year. You do get 2.5% growth. And we have been running, our estimates have been running a little bit low on the control. I can undo that if you want to see it back undone.
I guess, let me ask you, Frank, you made the point that we have a second bite at the apple on 22. How important, I guess, for the overall process are the short-term numbers versus the longer-term numbers?
Is that a question for me?
Well, for somebody, I guess somebody might know the answer, I guess.
Well, the planning estimates are just that, planning estimates. And, you know, the preliminary estimates and the official estimates are probably the, take a little bit higher importance, I would say.
Right. Because what, again, this is the challenge of playing all these numbers on the fly is you push in one place, something else pops out someplace else. And so when you look at this math here, you know, it stands out right away as the decline in sales taxes in FY23 from 22, which doesn't quite feel right either. Right.
Yeah, that's why I suggest, that's why it makes more sense to me to, if you're gonna take the optimistic in 22 to fix the growth rates in the out years. But I don't think I can do that on the fly.
Well, this is probably my fault for raising this point, so maybe we should just forget why I mentioned 22.
We'll ultimately be responsible for 22 through 24 this year, right?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
The question is, when do you think things will stabilize? Because they're going to have to.
Not necessarily.
All right, so you have the inflation fears coming through. That might pull people to pull back. You have the legislative bills coming through or not. And if they expand, then that's going to lead to more economic interactions. If not, we're going to see again a pullback. And if we have too many economic interactions with inflation, then the Fed will step in and they'll increase the interest rate to pull back. So, but I think they're going to act later. I'm thinking it's a 23, 24 issue, especially with election years coming up in 24.
All right, so where are we? Who wants
Greg,
to
can
go?
you get us those percent changes next time we meet, just in case?
Yeah, you know, you are going to meet
Sure.
in October,
Mhm.
which is 2 months away, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always a problem. I'm kind of with David on. I'm afraid of trying to switch the Excel sheet on the fly, because I'm afraid if we find out that something popped up wrong, then we're wrong, right? So if people want to argue, I think the control is pretty good, at least for the next 2 months. But if the majority, the consensus is I like 75% control and 25 optimistic, I'm totally fine with that. But I think it would almost be better just to put that into the original thing and say for 2 months, this is our initial idea for 2 months. We're either 100% this or 75-25, and leave it and come back 2 months to make sure we don't mess up something in the Excel sheet.
I agree.
Yep.
I would add a third. Forecasters always want more data anyway, so we'll just wait for more data to make better choices.
I agree.
So, Mr. Chairman, does that leave us with 100% control, or do you want the 75-25? I'll undo what I did.
Well, what I'm trying to figure out is what the group wants. And as far as I can tell, people are satisfied with the control, with obviously concerns about the uncertainty, but the uncertainty we have to live with. It's also the case that we're not making an official estimate. The rationale for this meeting in part has to do with our providing forecasts or planning to the CPE and other groups like that. But so do we go with the control, or?
I'm good with that, Frank.
Yep, sounds good to me.
Sounds like you have consensus.
Okay,
Okay, so the consensus is for 22, 12,940.5 with a 0.9% growth rate, and then the numbers you see on the screen for the remaining years. 100% control weight.
So Greg, for next time, would it be possible that we could have the spreadsheet set up such that we could adjust fiscal 22 so we don't have the same percent change problem?
Yeah, and to be specific, what we could do is change 22 and then you know, where you see individual income tax of 3.3% growth, you can fix those percent changes and then allow the dollars to flow to recognize the increase in 22. That can be done. It's a little more. I can't do it on the fly, but I can have it ready for next time.
Might have spreadsheets that do it both ways, just so we can kind of see. Because I think we all agree that fiscal 22 is kind of it's probably going to be an inflection year of some sort.
Okay. But for now, you're happy with the control that you see on your screen right now?
Yes.
apparently.
Okay. I'll assume a consensus is reached, and we still have to get through the road fund and the MSA. So I'm gonna go back to the slides. Michael, can you get back to the slides?
Road fund.
Yeah. Back in all revenue.
There we go.
All right, John.
I'll let you drive on the road.
I see what you did there.
Click the screen. Just click the middle of that screen.
There we go. Okay, this is looking at the road fund actual versus the estimated last year. We missed it by $64.6 million. The majority of that was in the motor vehicle usage tax. The motor fuels were also a bit lower than anticipated. We thought there would be a decline, but not quite as large of a decline. Nobody could have imagined what we saw in motor vehicle usage last year. As Greg mentioned before, the previous high for the motor vehicle usage was 514 million. So we were over $105 million more than we'd ever had in a single year in motor vehicle usage tax. So here's the road fund revenues compared to prior years. Had some good growth early in the 12s, 13s, 14s, and some declines. And you see the 4.8% decline in 20 and the large increase, 10.1% in 21. So, okay, so here's the motor fuels revenue. Early on, you can see the end of what I call the golden age of the motor fuels taxes. This was a time from 2005 through 2014 of an increasing tax rate. The variable portion over that period increased from 10 cents a gallon to over 26 cents a gallon. Then the decline in 15 and 16 as that rate went down to 19.1 cents per gallon. In that early period when we saw the increases, taxable gallons were decreasing in each of those years. And then from the fourth quarter of 15 all the way through 21, the tax rate has been unchanged. You can see that in terms of the low percentage increases in revenues. Also, at that time, taxable gallons were increasing over that period. However, it was fairly small. This is motor vehicle usage revenue, the history. You do see the large increase last year. And then in 15, we did have a decline there. That was when we had the trade-in credit on new vehicles, which reduced that. Let's see. So the forecast for the control scenario for the period, 2.6% in 22, small increase in 23, a decline in 24. In 22, you'll see that the fuels are fairly strong at 4.6%. We're still going to see some increase in the motor vehicle usage, even on top of that large increase we saw last year. We can look at some of the accounts and see what's happening here. So the motor fuels tax structure, again, there are two fixed components in the variable piece, which is 9% of the average wholesale price. For the forecast, the tax rate is forecast to be unchanged over this period. For last year, of course, now it's an annual change in the tax rate. For the prior year, the average wholesale price for the year was $1.62. The floor right now is $217.7. On the quarters, that average wholesale price ranged from anywhere from $1.33 to $2.11. So we're still well below the floor. And so we're going to keep the tax rate constant. Again, I used the same model that I've used before, where it's a function of US gas consumption. Here is the forecast for that. You can see the sharp drop off in 20. And then when it comes back, we do have an increase through the forecast period and also at a slightly higher level. The forecast for the fuels tax, again, is 4.6% in the control scenario next year. It's important to keep in mind that last year, through the first 3 quarters, fuels collections were down over 5% as people weren't traveling as much. There was a lot more staying home at work. Under the control scenario, that rate of growth declines throughout the forecast period. And then the alternative scenarios are either slightly higher or slightly lower than the control scenario. This shows the taxable gallons of motor fuels. And you can see in the first half where the consumption on taxable gallons was lower as that tax rate was quite high. And then in 15, when we've had the unchanging tax rate and the tax rate was lower, where consumption has increased. And of course, the large decrease, nearly 4.5% in fiscal 20, as more people stayed home and travel was restricted. So here's what the forecast for the motor fuels looks like in terms in a graphical sense. Motor vehicle usage tax. I use consumer spending on light vehicles, so I use spending rather than a number of vehicles sold. Again, it's interesting. You can see the drop off in 20 and the large increase we've had. And even though it declines over the next couple of years, we're still going to be at a much higher level than we have been in the past. And we'll see that reflected in the forecast for motor vehicle usage tax. So we'll see 2.5% increase this year, even on top of the large increase we saw last year, as the consumption still expenditures still rise. Then as they lower, we'll see a decline of 3.8 and 5.2%, and that levels off in the out years. And again, you see the alternative scenarios that bound the control scenario. This is the motor vehicle usage tax forecast in a graphical sense. This is the weight distance tax. It's a function of the industrial production of durables. This really kind of tracks the movement of goods across the highways. Again, you see essentially the same thing, big declines in 20, strong increases and at a higher level than we had seen in the past. So the weight distance forecast, strong increase under the control scenario this year at 7.1%, and then moderates to below 1% and 2% in the out years with the alternative scenarios on either side of the control. It's the forecast or the graphical picture of the weight distance forecast. Motor vehicle operators. This is your driver's licenses. Let's see. So we're going to have a decline forecast for this year, mainly because we had in fiscal 20, the fourth quarter receipts were low. They dropped from 4.3 million to about $900,000. And so that money came in fiscal 21. So the fiscal 21 receipts were inflated by what happened in the final quarter of fiscal 20. We're also getting some increased growth rate as the Real ID money starts to come online. Real ID has moved from a countywide structure to a regional structure, and it's taken some time to get the regional offices, find office space, hire employees, train those employees. So we do have Real ID money coming in those next couple of years for an increased growth rate in those years. This is the motor vehicle operators forecast graph. Only a single scenario under this. Motor vehicle license. This is based on vehicle registrations. So there's really kind of two major components in the vehicle license. This is your license plate, but it also has truck proportion. That's one of the IRP accounts that we've talked about, and it's fairly lumpy. So the blue line at the bottom, you can see kind of a gradual, this is the license portion. So it's your vehicle license. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a nice gradual increase up until fiscal 20 when it was lower. And that's based on the vehicle registration, and the red bar at the top is the truck proportion. So this is what creates some issues. It's lumpy, it doesn't come in on a regular basis. This is the registered cars and trucks, and you can see it's usually a fairly nice straight line, and that corresponds to the what we saw in the previous bit, the license portion. So the motor vehicle usage, when you add in that truck proportion, you're going to get some increases and decreases. So for fiscal 20, a decline of 7.3%, primarily because of the increase in fiscal 21 receipts, where we had fiscal 20 come in there, but also some of the IRP money. And then we'll see an increase in 23 and a decline in 24. And we get kind of an alternating path, mainly because of the IRP money. This is a chart for that. The other forecast is mainly fines and fees. It's fairly stable. There will be a decline this year, mainly because of some increased money in the prior year. This is the forecast, what it looks like, the graph on that. And this is the all the control optimistic and pessimistic total road fund. So under the control, 2.6 next year, 0.9 in 23, and a small decline in fiscal 24. And this is the graph of the three scenarios. And that's the road fund. If you want to do it, there we go.
That's one optimistic. Might want to move it over to control first or blend.
What you see here is the same spreadsheet for the road fund that you saw in the general fund. And you can see that I've got it weighted at 100% control right now. And that would be consistent with what we did in the general fund. And you can see the growth rate in the current year is a little bit more robust than it was in the general fund, 2.6% off a huge year last year, 10.1%. So you can either go with the control or make some adjustments to the road fund estimate as you wish.
Comments? Questions?
I'm comfortable with the control for now.
I don't think there's any reason to do this differently than the general fund.
I agree with everybody. It should be control if we're going to do this for general fund.
Agree.
Not hearing any objections, we're going with the control, I guess.
Yes, sir. I'll make note of that, and we'll document that. The final order of business we have is the MSA tobacco payments, and Michael Jones will dispense with that. I'm going to leave the table back to Dr. Jones.
Thanks, Greg. And of course, standing between everybody and lunch has been a long meeting, so I will go through this quite quickly. The initial slides just include some of the basic history of the MSA. Since we don't have any new members, you've all heard the history before. The MSA has the settling states and the member participating manufacturers, whether they be original to the original agreement or those that have subsequently joined. There's a significant amount of marketing restrictions, and we have to diligently enforce, and the OPMs and SPNs have to hold up their end of the bargain. The Commonwealth of Kentucky, we did receive $126.3 million in fiscal 21. That was a significant amount larger than what we expected. For the total, we have received $2.44 billion in the MSA payments since the 1998 signing of the agreement. There are three types of payments. There's the initial payments and the the initial payments and the strategic contribution fund payments, both of which are now gone. So all we have left is the annual payments. And that's what we received last year, and that's what we'll be receiving going forward. There's three potential adjustments to the payments. And I'm going to talk about this just a little bit longer to explain why last year's payment was so much larger than we expected. The first is the inflation adjustment. The inflation adjustment is either 3% or actual inflation as recorded by CPIU December to December. There is the possibility as we get closer to the end of this cycle, this year of forecasting, that we might assume a percentage increase larger than 3%. But as of right now, I have held the inflation adjustment at 3%. That's what it's been almost every year of the agreement's existence. And unless we see continued trends in CPIU growth going into December, it will probably be 3% this year. It could come close, it could be a little more, but right now my assumption is that it will be the minimum 3% growth. The other major adjustment is the volume adjustment. Now, the volume adjustment is traditionally just the relative volume of cigarettes compared to the base. And as smoking has become less and less popular and the numbers have declined, the volume adjustment has increased. That obviously lowers the amount that the companies have to pay to the settling states. Last year was extremely unusual. We have averaged long-term approximately 4 to 5% decline in cigarette volumes year over year. Some years have been more, some have been less, but it's averaged about 5%. Last year's volume adjustment was literally zero. You had to go multiple places past the decimal on a percentage to see any decline, which is extremely unusual. I'm guessing that money in pockets and nervousness about a pandemic led people to continue to smoke. There's also been increased taxes on vaping products, and vaping products got some relatively bad press, as there have been several diseases and deaths associated with certain vaping products, although in many cases those turned out to be black market items that had led to deaths. There's also a small component of the volume adjustment that adjusts the payments based on the profitability of the tobacco firms relative to prior the base years when the agreement was signed. We had small profit adjustments before, but they were in the magnitude of, say, $30 to $40 million nationwide across all state payments. However, the profit that the tobacco companies enjoyed last year was extremely large. I had used the consensus forecasting numbers for corporate profits. I believe it was approximately 12% when I made this estimate. And then the tobacco companies had $1 billion more in profit than the previous year. That alone increased our payment by approximately $7 million compared to what we expected. And then last but not least, the non-participating manufacturers adjustment. I'll explain that on the next slide, but just very quickly, those manufacturers who are not participating in the agreement, if they are found to have achieved advantages in the marketplace, and we as a state do not do everything that we should to properly enforce the agreement, our payment would be reduced due to those non-participating manufacturers gaining an advantage. When we presented these numbers last, there had been discussions, but not formalized decisions to settle some past years. When we settled those, that also increased our payments. So overall, our payment was so much larger because the volume did not decline, which was extremely unusual. The firms made a lot more money than we expected. So our volume adjustment further was reduced. In other words, we received more money, and we settled past disputes, and we received funds that had been locked up in escrow. So all of that added to approximately a $14 million increase relative to what we expected. Actually, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I believe it's almost $19 million more than what we expected. Again, this just explains the MPM adjustment. We've discussed this in previous years. It just explains that it can be punitive, but we have settled back years, so we are in a good place moving forward. So that brings us to the planning estimates. Again, the out years is not what I'm going to focus on very much, but for fiscal year 22 and 23 respectively, we're currently expecting approximately 109.8 million and 105.6 million. We do not do control optimistic, pessimistic for the MSA. These estimates, again, like I said, they assume profitability and volume adjustments go back to normal trends. There are a lot of other products in the marketplace. For example, there's a new synthetic nicotine lozenge called Zen, which is making quite a bit of inroads into the marketplace. Very few states tax this because most states, I believe the Commonwealth of Kentucky is included in this, we tax things that are tobacco based. So if you synthetically create nicotine, it is not subject to our current tobacco taxes. So between vaping, these other tobacco products, things hopefully returning more to normal as far as the economy and COVID situation, we're expecting the tobacco MSA payments to go back closer to where they've been in the past and continue to decline over time as smoking, again, continues to be a less and less popular activity. So again, for 22 and 23, back to about what we were expecting before, 109 and 105 million respectively. So that is the MSA. Obviously, we'll be talking about this more. We'll have more data on whether or not we expect the CPI numbers to hold up, if you will, and possibly adjust the inflation adjustment. But again, as more information comes in, these numbers may change, but I think this is about where we're headed, certainly for the next 2 fiscal years.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
You're absolutely welcome. Greg, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make? All right. Thanks everyone for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you. See you,
Greg,
see you in October.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your dedication and staying through a long meeting. We appreciate it and thank you for your time.
See
You
everyone.
You're doing an
Stay
amazing
safe,
job.
everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Stay safe.
Will do.